What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm your host, Josh.
And I'm Austin.
And I'm Daniel.
And we're back with another cult episode for you. Today we're going to be talking about probably one of the most bizarre, creepy meditation cults you've never heard of. I could pretty much guarantee that. I feel like this cult flies under the radar big time.
And you always think of meditation as being like this very calm, relaxing
I love meditation.
Tool. Yeah, it's very healthy. But she somehow turns it into insanity.
Well, it's like the big thing is when you start taking meditation and then claiming, well, through my meditations, you'll be able to access this cosmic library containing all the knowledge of the universe,
right?
Going all the way back to the very beginning of time. People are going to start being like,
Yeah.
Or they're going to be like, sign me up, because that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Akashic Records is a big component of this cult, and the woman that runs it, named Terri Hoffman, she starts from humble beginnings, as we'll get into, and she's a self-proclaimed clairvoyant who quickly realized that with these gifts that she claims to have and this knowledge she claims to have, that it is actually quite easy to manipulate people.
Oh yeah.
Into doing what you want to do, especially people come in and she creates this experience and all this lore around her ultimately new religious movement she starts, which is called the conscious development of body, mind, and soul. And so as many of these groups start out as like, we're just a religious movement, this is our beliefs, things maybe start somewhat innocent, but then as time goes on, it's just wild to me how often this happens with these types of groups where things get pretty nefarious pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think people are just, I don't know, when you're searching for answers as far as spirituality goes, I think you can be at a very vulnerable point in your life. And people like Terri Hoffman can see that. And they know how to manipulate you because you're that vulnerable, and good things tend to not happen when you're manipulating vulnerable people.
No, and that's what's crazy about it. And quite honestly, I find that these people are some of the most evil people in the world, because I feel like spirituality is such a sacred thing to all of us, and whether you're spiritual or not, this is dealing with like the inner sanctum of who you are, and something that people hold very dear to their hearts, and like this is something that you use to make sense of the world around you and make sense of, why we're here on this planet or what happens after we die. And when people come in and exploit that to me is just pure evil.
Yeah. And not even just your worldview, but like the actions you take to better yourself are now being manipulated. And you
have the answers.
Yeah. And you think you're doing something good and it might not be good at all, it terrifies me. I mean, I've said this time and again on many of our episodes, but people who can manipulate others are just terrify me. Those master manipulators are probably the scariest things we cover, even above all our ghosts and demons. I think, people who are pros at manipulation, terrifying.
Humans are almost more evil than these other paranormal entities.
Right. I'd rather take some Pazuzu or something.
Totally. I'd rather go toe to toe with the demon than one of these human monsters, because, the psychology is very interesting. I think there's a reason we're also intrigued by cults as well, because I think the more you dive into them, the more you start realizing it's actually far easier to fall into a cult than one realizes. I mean, I know for me, like going back a couple, maybe the beginning of the podcast, and even before that on my other podcast, we dove into a lot of these kind of new agey spiritual topics. And sometimes, I mean, you can find yourself falling down the rabbit hole a little bit, and you're like learning about all of these ideas. And for example, somebody who, is a big proponent of the Akashic Records, Edgar Casey, the sleeping prophet, he claimed to channel people's subconscious mind, and when he did his his readings, as well as access this cosmic library of data. And, and I think maybe it was because I was in more of a vulnerable place, and I think that's probably why I felt like I was starting to fall down the rabbit hole a little bit, because I was looking for answers.
Yeah.
And so, I had deconstructed from Christianity, and I was kind of like, okay, well, let me experience what else is out there. And so I found Edgar Cayce. And the reason I found Edgar Cayce was because my grandparents, big believers in Edgar Cayce.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And which is very interesting because, my whole family is either Catholic or Christian, but then my grandparents, they were very like new agey into, kind of Eastern philosophy, and very much into Edgar Cayce's teachings. And I remember kind of going down that way. I was like, wow, this is kind of interesting, and when you really start thinking about consciousness as a whole, it can be a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And it can be very easy to kind of like lose track of reality a little bit, because you start learning about all these ideas and theories. Right. Yeah. And you're like, oh, maybe things aren't what they seem.
Right.
And it can be very easy to kind of lose your way. And
even outside of spiritual cults or religious cults, I think cults still exist in respects like, this might piss some people off, and that's fine. And I was just talking about how cults can manifest more nowadays in like niche corners of the internet, I think is where they crop up. But people like Andrew Tate, I would consider a cult leader. He is not a religious cult leader, but I think there's an ideology there that he preaches, and people follow him like he is kind of this prophet. And so I think we see cults manifest even today that aren't specifically even religious, but
yeah, totally. And I think going back to the whole self-help topic, I think you could probably argue that for any self-help public figure.
Yeah, for sure.
You know what I mean? Like you look at Tony Robbins.
Yep.
And, some of the other people out there who make a living doing this, and, you start seeing like, well, they're, generating all this revenue, and, they're saying all of these things that are supposedly helping people, but is there, is that the real intention there, or is there other intentions behind it? And not saying that Tony Robbins is like, a cult leader per se, but I think the argument could be made for really anybody who is kind of preying upon one's consciousness and like the way that you view the world, the way that you view spirituality. And I think, it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. And like we're living in a more secular world now where people aren't really looking even for religion anymore. So where are the I don't know what you want to call them, the little shysters going? They're going to move away from religion because the cultural zeitgeist is kind of moving towards a more secular path. So they can still sell you on a cult idea, but it won't necessarily be religion. That's my kind of take on it,
Well, and like even with Terri Hoffman's group and other groups, the Blackburn cult that we've covered in the past.
I love that episode.
Yeah. I mean, it's super interesting because I think the way that cults operate is completely changed. And, back in the day, it'd be like posting an ad in the newspaper. You know what I mean? Like
come
self-help, and come, we'll show you the way when it comes to, spirituality and all that kind of stuff. And so nowadays you don't really, it feels like a lot of these cults operate, like, as you said, in the niche corners of the internet. And, sometimes you'll stumble upon them, and other times you'll, just run across their social media, and then you start listening to them. And before you know it, you're like entrenched in their whole following. You're paying like a monthly subscription for their teachings or videos or whatever it may be. And you start wondering, you're like, oh, am I in a cult? I think it's much easier than people think it is.
Yeah.
And before I kind of had a different take of like, oh, how could you ever, fall victim to a cult? But I think, the older I've gotten, the more I'm like, it's
very easy. Yeah.
Especially if you're in a vulnerable position, or you're somebody who's seeking out answers, and, maybe you're dealing with something in your life and you're looking for a solution to it. And then all of a sudden one day you run across somebody who addresses that problem, and they offer up a solution. They're like, if you try this, or try my 20-step program here for $99.99, I'll help you, get through that. It'll help you, battle this issue, improve your mental health. And so I think this whole problem has just been going on probably since the beginning of time.
Humanity. Yeah.
It's just like a human problem.
Yep. And speaking of $9.99 a month, you can hit me up on Patreon and I'll give you some spiritual videos, 20-step guide to fixing
only
your life.
20 steps.
Yeah, only. That's
and we'll even issue you your very own personalized library card to the Akashic Records.
There you go.
Where you can browse at your leisure and find out all the secrets of the universe.
All of it.
All of it. You will have all the answers.
Yeah.
Just $99.99. That's it.
That's
that
it.
simple.
Yeah.
But on the real, yeah, this episode's pretty wild. It's a lot of information to get through, a lot of different people involved with this.
Yep.
And what's interesting about this is it starts as a self-help movement, this new religious movement, and then things obviously get worse and worse over time, but then members start dying.
Yes.
And in many cases, I would argue in very suspicious circumstances.
In similar circumstances than, each other.
Right.
The cases are kind of the same.
Is something else going on here? Is there a connection between these deaths? And that's the big question mark here. Is Terri Hoffman potentially involved or influenced these deaths in any way? And I think there's a couple arguments that could be made. So without further ado, let's get into the Black Lord's cult and Terri Hoffman. Let's go back to the very beginning of Terri Hoffman's life, where she really led humble beginnings. She was born out there in the sweltering Texas heat in Fort Stockton in the year of 1938. Very different time period. Hard to imagine these days what it was like.
No AC.
No AC. That's a big problem for me. I've been very tough in 100+ degree weather.
Oh, yeah.
But people did it for many, many, many years. Today, Stockton is a fairly humble town in the Pecos area with a population of 8,400 people. And back in the 1930s, it had less than 3,000 people. So it really hasn't grown that much. The earliest accounts of Terri Hoffman's life in Fort Stockton are not ones that she recalled fondly. She was frequently bullied at school for a variety of reasons, which being in a small town made it even worse. I mean, I'm sure many of you can relate. If you've ever lived in a small town, bullying is usually pretty bad, I feel like, because it's just everybody knows everybody, and it's just, I feel like it's easier to do, but I don't know. That's just my own experience. But her family also grew up on the poorer side of town, which was used against her by her bullies. And on top of this, she also had an abusive and alcoholic father, and her mother was dying from a bout of tuberculosis, which is pretty serious. Not much is known about Terri's birth father. What little bit is known comes directly from Terri herself, but she's known to be a liar, so, you just kind of got to take her word for it. But according to her, her father suffered from severe anger issues that were made worse by his alcoholism. And because of this, he either went long periods without working, or he spent most of his money on drinking, which kept the family in constant financial trouble. As for Terri's mother, Terri said she almost had a sister, but she was tragically stillborn. And this might have had to do with the fact that her mother was terminally ill. And at that point with tuberculosis, I mean, that to me makes sense.
Yeah, complications and whatnot.
Back in the 1930s, tuberculosis was still a tough illness to get rid of. And today, modern medicine such as antibiotics and decades of natural immunity have made tuberculosis much less severe today. But TB was also difficult to treat in towns like Fort Stockton. For example, poor hygiene was a leading factor in TB-related deaths in the 1930s, even though the vaccine for it had already been around for more than a decade at the time. Terri's mother might have been battling complications from a bad pregnancy and or a bad immune system. And it's unclear why Terri was eventually given up to the Lutheran orphanage in Round Rock. At this time, she was only 9 years old, and you can only imagine how difficult this would have been for Terri and what an effect mentally and emotionally this would have had on her to be given away at 9 years old.
Oh, you're being abandoned by your family.
Right. I mean, that would be devastating for any child. But before she was sent there, young Terri was noted as having an overactive imagination. At age 3, Terri recalled how she was sitting under a tree and waiting the day away, just trying to escape the heat of the rough Texas sun. And while she was sitting there under that tree, she claimed 3 men in fancy robes approached her and began talking to her about God. Terri said that these 3 men were called the Masters, and they were just 3 of many more. And we'll circle back to exactly what these masters are a little bit later on, but fast forward to Terri at the age of 9. She was living at the orphanage in Round Rock, which is right outside of Austin, Texas. At the time that she moved there, it was a town of around 1,300 people, give or take a few. Nowadays, Round Rock has more than 100,000 people. While she was living at the orphanage, these masters visited her at their own leisure. Terri said that sometimes they would visit her when she wanted to see them, and other times they would visit her when she least wanted to see them. So it kind of just seemed like, they just kind of did their own thing. They showed up when they want to. And it's interesting, to think about this whole idea of these robed, I don't even know what to call them, entities or
who knows?
Apparitions showing up.
Are they prophets? Yeah, I don't know.
And after enough of these visits had happened, Terri would claim that she somehow discovered that she was the reincarnation of Saint Teresa of Avila. Saint Teresa, also known as Saint Teresa of Jesus, was a Catholic saint who lived in the 1500s, and she was very outspoken about returning to stricter religious rules. She loved fictional storytelling and was most well known for her writings and teachings about the 7 mansions on the way to being closer to God. And this is called the Interior Castle. How Terri saw Teresa in herself is still up for interpretation, but St. Teresa's writings didn't have that much to do with Terri's later teachings. Either way, Terri learned how to be manipulative at a very young age, and she continued to recount how she was taught how to pray by these masters. And this soon led to having visions of Christ and a German nun who would teach her about the Akashic records, as well as the concept of reincarnation, which I'm getting like multiple religious influences all coming together, which is kind of interesting. But let's go ahead and talk about the Akashic records for a second. This is also another thing that's kind of up to interpretation. Everybody who talks about this kind of have their own definition, I'd say. But basically, these records are a compendium of all elements, emotions, historical records, and spirituality from the past, present, and future. Universal knowledge.
It's the knowledge of an omniscient, omnipotent God, essentially. Everything. You literally don't need to know anything else if you can access these. It's all there. Good. Yeah.
The records are not stored in a physical text, but through a series of psychic understandings and what can only be described as a multiversal mental traveling. And the reason why there is so much indiscernible and unspecific elements of these records is mostly because they come from the movement of Theosophy. And, if you listen to different people, they'll tell you different things who claim to have accessed the Akashic records. Like they'll say, it's a bunch of scrolls, or, if you look up like an image on Google of it, it's usually like this cosmic library, like literally shelves of books and stuff like that, which seems kind of ridiculous to me. Because you're like, if you're dealing with, this place of universal knowledge, I have a hard time believing that it looks like our local public library.
No.
You know what I mean? Like that to me just seems, and maybe that's just artists' illustrations to try to like make it make sense for human brains.
Yeah. In reality, if this did exist, it probably wouldn't make any visual conceptual sense.
Right.
It would just be chaos.
Right. Exactly. I can only imagine. Some people say it's like a crystalline structures, and like when you go in there, it's all like a bunch of crystals, with different crystals for different people. Because that's the thing, is like you can go in there and access past lives and like every recorded event or piece of knowledge that's ever occurred since the beginning of the universe is all contained there.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is there's kind of in the New Age movement, there's a lot of people who have theorized that potentially some of the most intelligent individuals, which maybe this is a dig on them ultimately, now that I think about it, but like people like Albert Einstein or Nikola Tesla, people who have revolutionized life here on Earth with their inventions or knowledge, somehow accessed the Akashic records in order to obtain that knowledge and then basically channeled them, maybe without knowing, and then kind of brought it into existence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get it.
Which I feel like if you, that might be like...
I think it's cooler if they actually just did a lot of hard work and really studied something and mastered their craft. I think that's more interesting than them just like tapping into some weird cosmic universal knowledge.
But then someone might make the argument of, well, where did they get the thought to even look into that? Where did Albert Einstein even get to the thought? Where do you get that thought to discover, the theory of relativity and stuff? It's like, where did that originate from? Was that actually Albert Einstein's thought, or did Albert Einstein's consciousness access this record that's always been there subconsciously or in a dream or whatever? Right. I mean, who knows? But that's where the original knowledge came from.
Right. No, I get that that's the theory. I'm not, I'm not buying
sounds
it.
Like a bunch of,
I think Albert Einstein hit the books.
He hit the books.
Yeah. And he was just insanely smart.
It kind of takes away the one of the most beautiful things of being a human being is like discovery.
Yeah.
We're constantly discovering things and new things. And if there's just this like library, evolve the knowledge in the unknown universe.
It's a cheat code. Like you're skipping past the experience and just like, I got it. Yeah. It's easy.
And the thing that I struggle with too is like, well, people will be like, well, everybody can access it. And I'm like, that's sweet. Well, then why doesn't everybody access it all the time? And why are some people accessing it? You know what I mean? Like, why are some people accessing it and they never claim to access it? It's not like Albert Einstein was like, yeah, last night I went to the Akashic Records or, channeled them and I got this knowledge, but you never hear that. You know what I mean?
If I legitimately could access something like this, I promise everybody I would not hold my knowledge behind a paywall. I would make a YouTube video to be like, these are the exact steps I use to access this to benefit the entire world. Why hide it? Or why try and like make money off of it?
Yeah, no, it's a great point because it seems like it would be a great tool for all of humanity to know how to do. But then again, it's like, how do you prove that you actually got this from the Akashic Records?
Right.
You have no way of proving it.
You can't cite your sources on like which crystal you went to.
It was the red crystal on shelf 33 in section. You know what I mean? People be like, what the fuck?
They got the Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the thing about it is it's, this is a concept that we have no factual basis for or physical proof of. This episode is brought to you by my friends over at HelloFresh. I'm sure you've heard me talk about HelloFresh before. That's because not only do I love that they sponsor us, of course, but I'm actually a huge fan of their service. I've been using HelloFresh and been a paying customer of HelloFresh for the last couple of years, and it absolutely saves the day when it comes to mealtime at my house. My wife and I schedules are super busy, and the last thing we have time for is to think about the meals we're going to have for the week. And, we don't want to eat out every meal. It's expensive and just not that healthy. But HelloFresh has really changed the game for us. It's allowed us to eat healthier, which I absolutely love, but I still get to eat really delicious foods because their seasonal recipes always come in clutch. There's so many favorites that we have. I mean, we're talking katsu ramen to beefy enchiladas that they have. There's so many recipes that we love. Their burgers are top notch, actually. But most of all, I love the sheer convenience of being able to go on the app and plan out our meals for as far in advance really as we want to, and just kind of set it and forget it because everything is pre-portioned. It's shipped right to my door, and I just take everything out of the box, throw it in my fridge, and then it's ready to go when I get home from work. And meals come together in 30 minutes or less, and cleanup is always a breeze. And now that I have a little one in the house, she's starting to become a picky eater, and HelloFresh is really trying to help you out on that front as well. Because HelloFresh meals can be easily customized to fit your family's taste with protein and veggie swap options. You and the kids can choose just the right combos for each week's deliveries. And for many of you, back to school season is upon us. Last thing you got time for is figuring out what you're gonna have for dinner. So skip takeout, skip delivery, and get HelloFresh. And HelloFresh just announced their new 6-portion plans, which are perfect for feeding the whole family or to have leftovers for effortless lunches the next day. And right now, for a limited time, HelloFresh is allowing kids to eat free. Go to HelloFresh.com/lightsoutkids to unlock this exclusive offer. 1 free kids meal per box for 2 months while subscription is active. That's free kids meals just by going to HelloFresh.com/lightsoutkids, baby. It's no wonder that HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. I love it, and I know you will too. So if you're wondering what Theosophy is, circling back to it, it's a very all-encompassing religious and philosophical system that borrows elements from European philosophies and Indian religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. And some describe it as a form of occultism that grew in popularity in the Western world. The sigil combines religious iconography from the Jewish swastika to the Christian cross and many other religions. According to the founder, Helena Blavatsky, Theosophy is not a religion, but is rather a conglomeration of philosophy, religion, and science, which gives the name Theosophy. So Otstott does have science in it.
Yeah, there it is. So I don't know what science you're pulling from.
How much of it? What's the ratio?
Yeah.
You know? Over the years, Theosophy has become just another alternative religious movement, and despite attempts to distance it from the zealotry of the religions it borrows from, it becomes just another thing for zealots to follow, which brings us back to Terri Hoffman. Terri claimed she somehow learned how to access the Akashic records from a young age.
Somehow.
Which again, if you Google how to access the Akashic records on YouTube, you'll find step-by-step guides.
Oh, really? All
yeah,
right.
There's meditations, because it's like ultimately you need to like raise your level of consciousness and like, you know, put out intentions that I want to access the records and basically meditate, and you can do it.
Okay. I'll report back. I'm going to try this.
Yeah, do some homework.
Yeah. Might take me a while, but I will try.
It does take some practice, I hear. So, but somehow Terri just like randomly stumbled upon it, it seems like. And she never claimed to be part of the Theosophy movement, even though she borrowed elements from it, because of course not. Yeah. Why on earth would she ever give credit where credit is due?
Yeah. It's like, oh no, this is an original idea.
Just one day, just kind of fell, you know, I just accessed the library and boom.
Yep.
I had all this knowledge that already existed.
Yeah. I was daydreaming under a tree one day. 3 robed men approached me and just gave me a bunch of knowledge.
Here is your library card.
Yeah.
Go check out a few books. After 2 years living at the orphanage in Round Rock, Terri was adopted by a family who had recently lost a daughter to tuberculosis, and she was given the adopted name of Terri Lee Benson. While living as a Benson, Terri's life was pretty mundane, which was a welcome change from the intense poverty that she had come from. And while she was in junior high at the age of 15, she met an 18-year-old truck driver named John Wilder that she fell in love with. Kind of love that name, John Wilder.
Yeah.
And John earned 85 cents an hour and was described by Terri's adopted mother as a quote-unquote thug who wasn't good enough for Terri, even though it seems like he has a pretty good job. This did not stop either of them from dating, though, and after being together for only a month, the pair got married in Durant, Oklahoma. 18 months after being married, Terri gave birth to their first child, Cathay, and 4 years later, she gave birth to their son, Kenneth. Cathay is kind of an interesting way. It seems like you're just trying to do Kathy. But Cathay, maybe it's like Akashic records. Maybe it's like, I kind of can see a little bit of a play off of that, maybe, or maybe not. I don't know. Never met anybody named Cathay.
No.
Kind of interesting.
Sounds like a, what is it? What's the accent near, like, you know, Beverly Hills or whatever? Oh my God, Cathay.
I don't know what accent that is, but yeah, Beverly Hills accent, Cathay. So Cathay and Kenneth. And it was around this time in 1954 that Terri would start to dabble in more esoteric and philosophical groups and discussions. In the late 1950s, the first seeds of the person Terri would become were planted. The bored and wealthy women of the group she attended seemed to awaken something that Terri always tried to suppress, a part of her that had been visited by those 3 masters all those years ago. So she still doesn't really know who these 3 masters are.
Right.
But it's obviously a very like profound moment in her eyes and experience. This newfound outspoken religious side of Terri began to speak to a younger demographic. And going back to the 1950s and 60s, this was a time where a lot of people across America were starting to drift away from, you know, the religions of their parents, and there was a lot of things going on in the world. The world was recovering from World War II, and they were rapidly approaching the Cold War and, all of the panic that came from that. And so people are starting to, look for answers to why shit is happening the way that it is. Why is the world like this? And, obviously, whenever you talk about a war, there's lots and lots of death. Lots of people are losing their loved ones and trying to deal with the aftermath of these wars. And it's interesting because this is really, I think, when this whole New Thought movement really starts to take off and, only gets more and more intense as time goes on. But Terri claims that, you know what, I can provide that answer to you. Of course, if you're looking for, answers to why reality is the way that it is, the universe and beyond, come and see me.
She's got it. And, it started out innocent enough. And she suggested that, first, people
we got to start with the diet.
Yeah. Just fix your diet. What? Okay. Speaking of dietary stuff, that is very, a bit culty. You can see kind of elements from cults in dietary fads and stuff like that to some degree. So she preached the macrobiotic diet. And this was a diet that encouraged eating foods that are unprocessed, organic, and locally grown, and discourages eating high-fat, processed, salty, and sugary foods. Not a terrible diet. I think that's pretty solid. I also think your diet can change who you are to some degree. Your energy levels, your health,
Well, it's science.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just
you look
raw
at the
science
of how the body works and what the body needs nutrients-wise.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to figure out, what's good for you and what's not.
Yeah, fairly straightforward. So,
but to package these things into my diet is the right diet.
This is it.
This is the one.
Even though our bodies are all slightly different,
right?
You need to be eating what I eat. Yeah. Then as she started noticing people kind of listening to her, she showed them kind of just an acceptance that they were lacking before being introduced to her beliefs. And Terri soon became obsessed with books on hypnotism, the writings of Edgar Cayce, and also dove into power of positive thinking groups such as Silva Mind Control Incorporated. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I haven't heard of Silva Mind Control.
Yeah, so we don't have to dig too deep into it. If anyone's curious out there, a simple Google search, but it's a self-help, basically meditation technique. You kind of program yourself. It's like deep meditation to change things.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think mind control is kind of just a kind of clickbaity name.
Yeah.
But it's more controlling your own mind. But then also slightly, I think maybe what she's gathering is through meditation sessions, I can kind of manipulate your meditation over there.
Right. Well, they don't advertise that.
Right. Yeah.
But that's all. That's kind of
that's
not on the brochure per se, but that's super interesting. And this is kind of a funny story, but when my grandparents were moving out of their longtime home, I was down in their basement. And I was just kind of looking through they had all their keepsakes from their life and stuff. And I stumbled, I thought I grabbed it and maybe I have it somewhere, but I found a frame certificate from a similar group to this.
Really?
My grandfather went to one of these mind control psychic workshops or academies or something. And it said he had a certificate of completion of this mind control academy, so to speak, on it. And I always thought that was so interesting. And I was like, oh, kind of makes sense why you are the way that you are. Yeah. But he was super into it. And
wow.
He swore that Edgar Cayce healed a rotten tooth in his mouth and stuff. Very, very into it. So much so the Edgar Cayce Society still exists today that you can become a member of. And, they still promotes his teachings and stuff, but you can, if you're, he was also very into astrology, which I know you're not a big fan of, but,
whoa, don't put me on blast like that.
But am I wrong?
So many listeners are like, fuck Austin. No, yeah, I'm not a huge astrology guy.
You'll entertain it, but you're not
I think it's good if, I don't like when people use it to minimize others or stereotype others.
Sure.
I think that's where it's problematic, where it's oh, you're a Leo, you're a total piece of shit. That's where I don't like it. But I do like it as a self-reflection point.
Right. It's interesting to look at.
Yes.
Right?
And I've read some of the readings and stuff for my own. And yeah, it's interesting stuff. It's kind of a mirror to your life and you get to reflect.
Yeah, what's interesting is that for like one of our birthdays, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, you can get your birth chart worked up
Right.
by them, but they do this like very comprehensive like birth chart that's based on Edgar Casey readings, and they don't just give you like the birth chart and be like, well, your moon's this, your sun's that, but they actually break down like periods of your life, like all the way from the beginning to your development as a human being, and kind of give you this like psychic reading of your life and like who you are deep down inside. And I swear on everything that is holy that
They nailed it.
They nailed it.
Yeah.
Like to a scary amount. Yeah. And like after I read that, I'm like kind of low key a believer, because I'm like, wow, this is like very accurate. I don't know really what this is based upon, but this is crazy. Like it explains it to a T. Then I had it done for my daughter, and so far it's like, which I thought would be really fun to like follow her from birth and like follow her sort of like life path, her guide, and it's been like spot on. It's pretty nutty.
Yeah.
So if you're interested, I'll drop the link. Not sponsored, by the way, Edgar Casey.
Yeah.
Just very interesting if you're looking for like, I use this with quotes, but reputable source to get a birth chart and kind of psychic reading. It was accurate for me, may or may not be for you, but definitely worth looking into. So I think that, and oftentimes with these types of groups, there's like nuggets of truth in there. And I think sometimes it is kind of easy to be like, oh, well, since there's some nuggets of truth here, it must all be true.
Right.
And I think Terri's kind of experiencing this and kind of like, oh, okay, or she's also realizing some of the other perks that come along with, diving into mind control, and things like that. She's like, oh, this meditation is great, but how can I then utilize this meditation to manipulate others?
Right.
And that's the difficult thing with it. But it's interesting. I mean, I find it all very, very interesting.
Yeah. I've had my psychic reading done, and I've read like through a lot of astrology things and whatnot.
You find it's accurate or for you?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the reason why it's so accurate is coming just from a writer's background. I think the writing is a perfect combination of like vague and just accurate enough to convince. So that's where I always kind of come at those writings from. Obviously, I haven't tried what you have done, but I'm interested. I should.
You should. It's very, very, and it's actually pretty like cheap. It's not like they're trying to make like a shit ton of money off of you to do it.
And I'd be interested in just seeing the writing.
Yeah,
just kind of studying like how they formulate these readings is, I find fascinating just from a writer's standpoint.
I can tell you that they go deeper than just surface stuff.
Yeah,
that it goes deep, like internal things that only I would know, and behaviors that only I would know. And I think
you cheated on your math test in 4th grade.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's like not only like positive, but also like some of your weaknesses and negative characteristics.
And that's why I think that's kind of stuff is a good reflection point. Cause it focuses it's not just, jerking you off. It's here's where you can work on things and maybe consider this.
It's like self-realization of like, oh, this is weird that this is weird, accurate to some extent, but like it causes you to stop and think like, oh, maybe I do those things, or like, how is this behavior or thought influencing others or events in my life? And it's interesting. I don't know how else to explain it. You just got to go and try it, but
I'm down.
But they'll like send you like a whole little, like, it's like a little book.
Oh, that's nice.
So it's like, or like, it's at least like 30, 40 pages of information on yourself, which is pretty wild.
That is wild.
So highly recommend it.
Yeah.
But anyways, we should get back to Terri.
Yeah, to loop it back. She also opened up to these wealthy, kind of bored women. They didn't have day jobs, and they would meet at Brookhaven Country Club, where they would discuss mystic matters. And these women that she found there soon became her first few followers. She led them in pricey meditation sessions where she described the different, quote, temples of the higher realms. And apparently these meditations came across kind of like a tour guide to the astral plane rather than an exercise to open your mind. I think meditation is different for everyone. Meditation can mean a lot of different things. Meditation can be prayer. So what she was doing with meditation was like exploring a large home, like like a mansion. You're going into different rooms. She would lead her followers in this type of meditation. And it was a state kind of like a hypnotic trance. And we've even, I think in some of our hypnotic regression therapy sessions, it's kind of like that to a degree. And she would tell them they were entering a higher plateau of spiritual development. And here they could find the temples of the world's spiritual masters. So these spiritual masters included Jesus Christ, Buddha, Lao Tzu, and Muhammad. They were all so very big religious figures. Were these spiritual masters, and you kind of go in.
My grandparents talk about these too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is just more specific to Edgar Cayce's teachings, but many people refer to them as the ascended masters, is what they're called.
Okay.
And, it is all of like the spiritual leaders of the world. And that was what was really interesting to me, especially coming out of Christianity, was hearing like, oh, Jesus was actually spiritually enlightened, but then so were all these other people too. He wasn't the only one, and they're all a part of the ascended masters that have been, I guess, sent to earth to kind of lead our spiritual development.
Yeah.
And that was
I could see how that would be appealing, especially to someone who's deconstructing from Christianity, because you can still accept like Jesus may have been in on something, but no, here's like, he's actually a part of this. He's not the ultimate authority. This Christian God isn't the ultimate authority. There's actually a bunch of voices of authority. I think that's really appealing to, especially in this context of the 50s, 60s, 70s of people leaving Christianity. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, and if explained in the correct way, I feel like it kind of brings everybody together.
Yeah, definitely.
The religions aren't really against each other. We're all...
It's bridging the gap. Yeah.
Exactly, and I find that to be a really positive thing.
It is, definitely. So Terri also showed her more controlling and manipulative sides kind of early on. Not immediately, but as they started to get into this, she did. One of the services she offered was determining whether or not two people were each other's soulmates.
Matchmaking, baby.
Yeah, classic matchmaking, yeah.
Big money there.
Yep. And she claimed she could access the Akashic records, and then she could tell her followers either yes or no, they are or they are not soulmates in front of everyone too, which is kind of an awkward experience, right?
Wouldn't that be awkward? You're like married to somebody for like 20 years. You go to Terri. Terry's like, all right, let me check the records. I'll be right back. Yeah, you guys aren't soulmates.
Absolutely not.
Like, if you really were starting to believe her, you'd be like, that'd be devastating.
Devastating.
Like,
and I think what she's doing also is she's adding that like group pressure. She's like, everyone else is here and they've all now witnessed me access these records and tell you that you're not fit. So it's very manipulative, right?
Yeah, it's awkward.
Yeah. And so this would end up causing a bunch of commotion. Multiple couples had falling outs with each other. People got divorced. Yeah, it was mayhem. And yeah, if you truly believed, why wouldn't you listen to her, right? To make even more money, she also sold tapes and booklets of her teachings, and she had private consultations with her close followers. And on the side, to make even a little bit more money, she ran a jewelry business.
Yeah, baby.
Like, what? All right. Guess
she's like Johnny Dang on the side. Yeah. She's like, come get iced out, baby. Yeah. Take it to the Akashic Records and we'll go to the jewelry store.
Right. Yeah.
Buy you a grill.
And as far as I know, there was no connection to the jewelry and like her teachings.
Well, I will say, I believe she was selling a lot of crystal jewelry.
Ooh.
And crystals definitely play a big part in all of the spirituality. Definitely. In these teachings,
everyone
crystals
I know
have powers.
Yeah. And
some people don't believe that, but I, for one, for a while, definitely did.
Yeah.
And amassed a gigantic collection of crystals.
Mm-hmm. Everyone I know who's on the like astrology, more secular beliefs, they all have crystals.
Yeah.
Big thing. Yeah.
I am still not quite sure if I can attest to directly benefiting from the powers of crystals, but I do find it to be, because like there's some crystals that age your consciousness,
mm-hmm.
and there's so many, cleanse energy, chakras, all that kind of stuff, like all that's very interconnected. So, and although I don't know, like, it's hard to find like pictures of her jewelry and stuff. And I think it was a lot of like gems. So like rubies, emeralds, things like that, more of like the gem jewelry versus like rough cut crystals.
Right.
Is all like polished.
And we'll also see her followers will gift her jewelry or leave her jewelry to then go sell and feed her business.
But this isn't totally uncommon either. I know I've found many spiritual groups like this who also sell crystals.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Crystal jewelry.
Definitely. So what she actually taught, one of the things was the law of karma and reincarnation. This isn't an original concept, but she also really was about acceptance and love, especially at first. But she said those things were above all else.
So that resonates with people.
Absolutely. Who's going to be like, ugh, acceptance and love? No, like,
please, I want hate and fear.
Yeah.
Where's that teacher at?
Yeah. Oh, they're out there. They're called politicians. Am I right?
Yeah.
So basically, if you lived a good life, you would be able to choose the body and environment in which you would be reincarnated, that's
dope.
Sweet. Yeah.
Sign me up.
And those who led unhappy lives paid for a karmic debt for their past deeds.
So she stole this from Eastern philosophy,
and
religion,
and kind of bastardized it. Yeah, and she would do these things. It was weird. She would get everyone in the room, and she would turn off the room lights, and she would have her followers hold a piece of tinted plastic in front of their face, and then she would shine a flashlight on their features and claim they could see some form of someone of their past lives, kind of just an impression of it on their face.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Was it a reflection?
Yeah, where it's just like they're distorted.
It's her in the tinted plastic. She's like looking at herself.
Right. Yeah, it's like, a mirror. Yeah, so kind of bogus, but would be a fun show to see.
Absolutely.
She wrote, quote, "The result of noble death is rebirth. We can be sure that the people who have been killed in volcanic eruptions and dire catastrophes have deserved these violent deaths, and that they have been reborn in those places to fulfill their destiny. They reaped as they sowed in past lives." Terrible take.
Yikes.
Terrible take.
Yeah.
Good God. So that's
one way to explain it, I guess.
Yeah, that's awful. She would also lead her students on a tour of the temples of the higher realms, and this was during their meditation sessions. This was kind of like the mansion thing that they were doing. There was the astral realm for emotions, mental for logic, and ether for the highest realm where the soul itself existed. She eventually claimed that she had the powers of levitation. So supposedly one night she was in bed and her husband apparently confirmed this, but she just whoop up and levitated and then came back to bed.
See, I think that I highly doubt that happened really, but I think she stole this idea from, there's actually stories of monks levitating during meditation. You can Google this for yourself. And it's been a while since I've gone down that path, but I believe it's like, there's like verified pictures of monks levitating while meditating.
She has ripped everything.
So she's, to me, just ripping off all these stories that are absolutely insane and would make everybody pause and be like, whoa, maybe you really know what the fuck you're talking about.
Yeah. I remember, I think the Japanese cult, the Om Shinrikyo. I think he was like, I can levitate as well. And he would often do the tricks. She also said she could heal the sick through meditation. Also through meditation, she could reroute the future of reality to avoid lethal accidents.
So you can see this shift of like, I am a guide to like, I am godlike.
Yes.
It's like over time, the more she gets into this, the more she starts shifting,
she's
her
performing
status.
miracles, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
When you're
through
like,
meditation.
I can reroute the future, baby.
Yeah. It's crazy. So even more evidence of her manipulation would be seen in how she utilized her, quote, gifts to heal people. It didn't matter if they were young, old, poor, rich, unknown, or famous. There was one couple that Terri was afraid for because she said that the girlfriend would die in a car crash unless they had an emergency medical meditation session right then and there. So they did. And at the end, Terri said, crisis has been averted. No more car accident. We did it. And how can you even prove that, right? It's just
There's no
the
way
accident didn't happen. I drive
Maybe
to
that
and
was
from
never
work.
in your future.
Exactly. Yeah. She later one-upped herself. This is hilarious. She one-upped herself when Jimi Hendrix died. Rest in peace.
Yeah.
One of the best guitarists
Seriously,
of all time.
legend.
Yeah. She said that his rampant drug use gave him, quote, bad karma. But if they all meditated positively enough, they could save him in the afterlife. And Terri claimed this was a success. We did it, guys.
We did it. Save Jimmy.
He didn't need saving. He's doing fine wherever he is.
Yeah, that just seems like a marketing ploy, if you ask me.
Who was like the biggest name in rock and roll at the time, right? So it's more clickbaity stuff, basically.
I can just like see her like having a meeting and they're just like listening to Jimi Hendrix. She's like, yeah, I saved him.
Yeah.
I saved him. Even though he died, saved him in the afterlife.
We did it.
We did it.
Right here.
We did it, Joe.
And I stand up next to a mountain.
Yeah.
So let's fast forward to the late 60s. Terri's true intentions began to shine. The whole time she had pretended to be a force for positive change in these young people's lives. But she became much more invested in her material goods. She bragged about a boat they had just bought, a new dress she had found at the store. She soon began charging individuals for the meditative practices and private lessons even more. Sometimes this would cost upwards of $100. Which in 1960s money, that was a lot. And this initially upset some of her followers because she was like, at one point, this wasn't behind a paywall. Why is it so expensive now? And it's getting worse.
And that's a big argument a lot of people make about people who claim to have this spiritual knowledge is like, if you're really in it for the right reasons and intentions, why are you putting it behind a paywall?
Right. And like
aren't you here to like just help people?
Right.
But why are you charging people to get that help and guidance?
And like, would the masters, would Jesus Christ and the Buddha be interested in you charging? It seems to go directly against their teachings. So I don't know what's going on.
I don't remember Jesus ever putting his teachings behind a paywall.
Right. He rose Lazarus from the grave, but then he's like,
yeah, I'll send you the bill later. Where do I make that invoice out to?
Yeah. But even her husband, John, became more upset at this. He's like, actually, this is
bad publicity.
Yeah, this
and makes him
too
look
far.
bad.
Yeah, because, it's like we're married and you're doing this shyster stuff. So the 60s was basically the last decade of men being the sole breadwinners in the house. So he wasn't only mad at like, ooh, this is a bit icky. He's also now mad because it's like, what, you're making more money than me? No, yeah. So classic old school misogyny here. And Terri began making his week's pay in a single afternoon.
Damn. Oof. Probably from like 3 sessions.
Yeah.
It'd be like more than he made in the whole day.
Yep. And so tensions rose between them, obviously. Things weren't looking good. Divorce was imminent. And 2 people, Sandra Cleaver and Glenn Cooley, would only make things worse. Sandra Cleaver could be best described as a fanatic of Terri's. She bought into everything that Terri was selling, and she would also shower her with gifts and support, and she became one of her closest followers. Glenn Cooley was a close follower as well, but not for the same reasons. He had developed a sexual attraction towards Terri, despite her being married. And he would try to find any opportunity to sit next to her, hold her hand, and attend every meditation that he could.
Slide into her DMs.
Yep.
I mean, where's the OnlyFans link?
Naturally, this caused some tension between John and Terri, and she insisted, look, hey, nothing's going on. Also, it's probably like, he's giving me a ton of money, so I'm going to milk this guy for everything that he's
Terry's
worth,
like,
right?
hell yeah.
Yeah. But that didn't seem to be the truth, and Terri filed for divorce on December 28th, 1970. So clearly, it was a problem. During the proceedings, John would sign psychiatric committal papers with the support of Terri's adoptive mother for Terri herself. Terri would go on to be cleared with a good bill of health from a doctor, but she ended up losing custody of her 2 youngest children, access to the family bank accounts, their home, and all of the furniture inside.
Which we don't know exactly why.
No.
She lost custody of the other 2.
Yeah. Is it because of the psychiatric stint where the husband could now, in cahoots with the mother, could be like, look, we even had to send her to a psychiatric facility. She's not stable. I think it
must have been something
dirty
like that.
Divorce play or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But she would retain custody over only the eldest child, Kathy, as well as her 1968 Cathay, yeah, as well as her 1968 Mustang, some stock options, a shotgun, a rifle, and a pistol.
She's like, I don't want anything else, but just give me the Mustang, the stock options, and the guns, baby. She's like, I'm good. And I'll just take the oldest.
Yeah.
It's so like, that is the
Crazy.
weirdest. Like,
I don't, what's this divorce? I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in these divorce proceedings. What's going on here?
It's like, definitely don't want to leave my ex-husband with the guns, though.
Yeah, right. And that's crazy. If they were using the psychiatric hospital stay as leverage, then it's like, oh, now she's getting all the firearms too. That doesn't seem to add up.
Different time.
Yeah. So on March 23rd, 1971, the divorce was finalized. 2 months later, Terri would marry Glenn Cooley. This was the guy that was, getting really close to her.
Getting a little handsy.
Yeah, at a small ceremony in New Mexico. After getting married, Terri and Glenn purchased a home in Dallas. Sandra, who was her close follower, wasn't that far away, and after settling in, Terri began her lifelong goal of establishing a religious movement, finally giving it the name Conscious Development of Body, Mind, and Soul, or simply Conscious Development. And to understand how much of a stranglehold she had on Sandra's devotion, we need to understand Sandra's own life a little bit and how she practiced what Terri had preached.
So Sandra Cleaver was married to a man named Chuck Cleaver, and they were high school sweethearts who married fresh out of college. While Terri had grown up in poverty, it was kind of the opposite for Sandra. She was a trust fund girl who never really knew what it felt like not to have stability in her life. But what Sandra's life had in financial stability, she had lacked in emotional strength. She lost her mother to tuberculosis, the same as Terri, and while Terri's sister was stillborn, Sandra's was placed in a mental hospital only to tragically die in a car crash in 1961 at the age of 17. So there you go, major traumatic events that happened to both of them, and that's going to create a connection.
And not only traumatic events, but like very similar traumatic events.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty wild. They probably were like, whoa.
Is that coincidence a bit?
Like, is this fate bringing us together?
Yeah, maybe there's some cosmic. Yeah, exactly.
In 1964, Sandra and Chuck had a daughter named Susan. And in 1966, Sandra's father died in a plane accident shortly after his retirement from his engineering job.
That's brutal.
These series of events would seem to have a profound impact on Sandra as she would drift away from the Christian church in search of something that she felt gave her more definitive answers. She'd begin to believe very strongly in the healing powers of certain gems and jewelry.
There you go.
Going back to our crystal conversation from earlier. She believed so strongly that she wouldn't take off most of her jewelry at all, which include several necklaces, bracelets, and 14 rings. Yeah, didn't matter if she was awake, asleep, in the shower, the jewelry never came off. That means she just was like, I need this. It's providing me all these benefits. She also bought into the homeopathic medicine fad of the 60s and 70s. Sandra would connect with a medical professional in Mexico thanks to word from her mystic friends. The doctor would ship huge amounts of pills on a Greyhound bus directly to these women. And guess what? Sandra was one of his biggest clients. Chuck would go on to say that these pill bottles would take up an entire kitchen cabinet in their home.
Holy crap.
That's a lot of pills.
Yeah.
And who even knows what this stuff is? And he would notice Sandra taking upwards of 20 pills a day. Worried, Chuck took a sample of the pills to his doctor, who assured him that these pills were only placebos.
Nothing in there. What a racket. You just you're filling little plastic capsules with sugar and then sending it and selling it to 1 million women. Come on, that's crazy.
But while the physical contents of the pills weren't anything to be concerned about, they spoke to Sandra's rapidly declining mental and emotional strength, because If you feel like you need to take
20
pills,
yeah, that's really sad.
And you need all this jewelry all the time just to be okay, definitely something else going on. She then insisted that their 6-year-old daughter, Susan, should start taking them as well.
Oof.
Sandra insisted on feeding their adolescent girl dozens of placebo pills a day to fix something that wasn't even wrong, just because she felt like that's what she needed to do, I guess.
She's like projecting on her child.
Right. This pattern of disturbing behavior from Sandra would only worsen with time. Chuck came home from work one day to find Sandra trying to hurry out of the house with Susan, revealing that she was taking their daughter to San Diego to meet with a homeopath doctor who would put Susan in a quote-unquote special machine. Kind of weird. This machine would apparently tune out all of the world's bad vibrations. Chuck disagreed and refused to allow his daughter, Susan, to leave, which, a good call. Because, I mean, who knows what she's going to do? Like, it's just so random. Another time, Susan was running a high temperature and was sweating so badly that her bed became wet. Sandra insisted that some meditation, incense, and incantations would clear that fever right up. While Chuck insisted on taking her to the doctor, Sandra said, "Over my dead body."
Man.
Poor kid, man.
Yeah.
Chuck then waited until Sandra was asleep next to him and then took Susan out of the house and drove around for 2 hours until his doctor woke up. And that's when he took her to go get treated properly. The doctor then diagnosed her with scarlet fever.
Brutal.
Which in the 1960s, scarlet fever was at an all-time high and was the leading cause of death in infants and children.
And she wanted to meditate that away.
Yeah, so if Chuck had agreed with Sandra and Sandra took Susan to go see the homeopath doctor, it's very possible their daughter would have died, which is extremely sad to think about. And this wasn't the only time that Sandra didn't have her daughter's wellness in mind. Once Chuck recalled how she waved a butcher knife in the air during a disagreement and said, quote, "Sometimes I think Susan would be better in heaven."
Time for divorce at that rate.
Yeah. So obviously her mental state was rapidly deteriorating if she's doing stuff like that.
Yeah. Just threatening that your daughter's
life.
mean,
that's major red flags. It's time to do something.
Yeah.
And it seemed like Terri was pulling some of the strings. Chuck didn't approve of Terri and found her frequent arguments with, at this particular time, her husband was John, to be very off-putting. And despite Sandra being so devoted to Terri, he saw straight through her manipulations. He also frequently argued with Sandra on the amount of gifts and money that she gave to Terri. When Terri,
I would really hope I would be Chuck in this scenario. Like, that's who I would love to be. I know, like, I'm not saying I'm above, any of these people, but I hope that if this scenario ever came about, I could be more like Chuck. Be like, I see straight through your bullshit, and you're manipulating my wife, and you're endangering my child, and I'm putting an end to this.
Yeah, I mean, that just is a good person ultimately, a good father, but a good person.
Yeah,
who's not falling for it. When Terri was getting divorced from John, she told Sandra that it was because he was, quote unquote, impeding her spiritual growth. And on April 22nd, 1971, only 3 months after Terri got divorced, guess what? Sandra also got divorced. Telling Chuck that same excuse.
Yeah.
Chuck, you're impeding my spiritual growth. Sandra tried to argue that Chuck was controlling and that she was more than a competent mother. She would call on her mystic friends to submit letters detailing her mental health. They also claimed that Chuck was unreliable and problematic, which, what's the examples for that? It seems like Chuck is a pretty responsible, unproblematic person. He literally drove your daughter around for hours so that the doctor would become available to save her life. But
if you get it
unreliable.
Yeah. And if you get enough problematic people to submit letters that's saying Chuck is the bad one, then I don't know, that could sway a potential judge.
Whereas Chuck leaned hard into Sandra's frequent failures over their daughter's welfare, her interest in the occult, and her disturbing devotion to Terri's teachings, he desperately wanted to get their daughter Susan away from all the metaphysical mental manipulation that her mother was slowly dragging her into. But in the end, Chuck ultimately agreed to visitation rights and keeping his personal property after his lawyers were concerned that Sandra would kill Susan as revenge if he gained full custody. Whew, it's pretty messy.
Yeah.
And at the center of this failed marriage stood Terri Hoffman, known at the time as Terri Cooley. And with Chuck out of the picture now, Terri and Sandy became glued at the hip. As, Sandy's just left her husband, she's desperate and lonely, and Terri was eager to treat her like a queen until she got what she wanted from her. Sandra soon bought the group a printing press and then utilized her jewelry knowledge to help sell pieces for money. And she handled all the payment for the meditation services, which had become extremely popular throughout Dallas and really just the Southwest in general. Between 1972 and 1977, Terri's conscious development group rapidly expanded with over 100 members under her umbrella, and all of them paid to be there, and all that money went the only place it should go in Terri's eyes, right to her personal bank account. It's like, oh, I have this religious movement, I should set up like a nonprofit, and no, just put it all in the personal bank account, put it in my Wells Fargo account.
Yep.
I'll deal with it from there.
And imagine 100 members, and she was charging, $100 for a private consultation, plus all the money from the meditation sessions, plus all her booklets and tapes that she was selling. Yeah, there could be some
stacks
serious
of cash,
money.
baby. Yeah, she's thousands of dollars.
And all the jewelry and stuff, too.
Yeah.
That's big money.
But then in 1977, despite some members being pretty vocal about some of their concerns over Terri's increasingly manipulative behavior, she made the decision that quickly turned conscious development from a little mystic group into a lethal cult. Within the main body of the group were 40 handpicked members that Terri believed were her closest allies, and they worked directly under her, leading meditations and teachings. And one day in 1977, she called them all together and commanded that they do more than just help others become enlightened. They now had to fight directly against the forces of evil. And this would be a fight of intense mental and spiritual focus, because these forces of evil, she called the Black Lords, manifestations of pure evil that were hell-bent on destroying everything good in this world. Of course, right?
Yeah,
of course.
Right, yeah, of course.
Everything good
this
destroyed by the Black Lords.
Right.
Well, no wiggle room.
No. This is pretty huge, right?
What a shift.
We're no longer just trying to better ourselves or access knowledge.
We are under attack.
Yes. Yeah.
Everything you love that you've been meditating about is now potentially going to be destroyed.
Yeah. And that's like checklist of a religious cult that we've made it here.
Hear this so many times. It's
hinges
always
upon like something.
Doomsday.
Yeah. So dire. Yeah.
Shit's getting real.
Mm-hmm.
Although nothing real ever happened.
Yeah, right.
Let's be honest. And the only thing standing between them and victory were the dedicated souls of conscious development. This revelation turned meditations and study sessions into intense sequences of spiritual battle. The group would sit in meditation circles surrounded by a series of items meant to represent weapons and shields. Terri would instruct them on how to utilize them and how to defeat the Black Lords. So what? Now it's a LARPing club? Like what are, like, seriously? It's like, all right, this is how you stab, parry. It's like, I don't know.
It's like super cringy.
It's very cringy. These battles would slowly graduate from sitting down and making deliberate movements to standing up, shouting and pointing with rods.
Good Lord.
You can only imagine. I wish we had this on video.
Yeah.
But even when a battle ended in total victory, Terri would frequently tell them how, well, we may have won that one, ladies, boys, but it ain't over yet. The war's still going. It's just one little battle.
Of course,
in the grand scheme of things.
How would they just? You can't just let it end, right?
No.
You gotta get them hooked.
No, and like you're fighting evil spiritual entities with rods.
Yeah,
how's that working out for you? Seems like you got to up the firepower here.
I'm interested, actually. I'm invested in this.
Yeah.
I want to see what if they should advance the weaponry in this.
Yeah, they need to level it up,
get
man. Get the armory
guns.
going.
Yeah.
Got to get the mages out.
Yeah.
Where's the warlocks? Let's go. Well, this is how she stepped things up. She gave the Black Lords names in order to focus the energy of their attacks. And these names were oddly specific. They were the names of former Conscious Development members. Oh, man. What a plot twist.
Yeah, I love this.
Including names like Susan Cleaver.
You think
that Black Lord we're fighting? Yeah. No, it's not some demonic name. It's Susan
Cleaver.
Like
from Austin, Texas.
Like, like, come on. You can't make this shit up.
So it is a bunch of goobers.
Oh, my God.
Man.
It's just, this is like on a whole other level here.
Yeah. Because you at least kind of have me in this. If we're just going fully in this direction of like Black Lords, cosmic warfare,
right.
Spiritual warfare. Okay. Like, I mean, that's not far from the mythos of most other religions. I get it. But then now you're like, that is so good a manipulation where it's like, it's her actually. Guys, wait. It's someone who was once among us. That's why
they have turned on us and they're fighting this war against us.
Yeah.
If you're not with us, you're against us.
Exactly.
And must be destroyed.
Yeah. So in 1976, Terri's then husband, Glenn Cooley, had finally decided that he wanted to divorce her and wanted to get the hell out of conscious development. He was beginning to have some serious doubts about the whole thing, and while it's unclear if Terri's revelation of warfare and the Black Lords was part of that, but I mean, you could kind of say that it's definitely a possibility.
Got to imagine that some people, when she started being like, well, the Black Lords' names are
Susan,
be like, what?
Yeah.
You lost me there.
Like
I've been here every step of the way, but I'm not vibing with this one. Like,
yes, for sure. So on paper, the divorce was amicable. In other words, both parties, they had agreed on the terms and the court proceedings were fairly simple. This began on November 24th, 1976. But only a few days later, Glenn submitted a waiver to speed up the process and it was granted, officially terminating their marriage on January 27th, 1977. And I always wonder, I mean, why was that? Why did he want to speed that up? I mean, if we're already talking about Black Lords, spiritual warfare, enemies of the cult, I can only imagine that Glenn might have felt that he was maybe next.
Or do you think that when this was all happening, if Terri ever threatened him?
I could believe that for sure.
I always wondered that. I'm like, what was she really saying when this was going down?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And knowing how manipulative Terri is, maybe it's not like a direct threat. She's very good at like, these. No, it's kind of like through the mythos of the religion, you're going to get threatened. So only 6 days later, Alice and Don Hoffman, who had become very close with Glenn following their joining of the religious movement, would announce that Glenn had sadly committed suicide. A little bit of backstory on Alice and Don. They actually lost their 3-year-old child in a drowning accident just before they joined this religious movement. And I believe Alice was one of her closer followers and also a teacher in the cult. But they went and they discovered Glenn's body. But here's where things get strange. They wouldn't have even known to look in his cabin if Terri hadn't found a letter supposedly left by Glenn inside the locked safe of their home. The letter apparently read, quote, "I, Glenn Cooley, give to Terri Cooley all of my property, both personal and real. This includes 2 boats, a 1972 Buick Limited, all jewelry and equipment for its making, all furnishings for the house on Dunhaven Road, and all cash." So his will left everything to her, basically. And
Which I think this is a little suspect.
Very.
My sensors are going off.
Yeah.
Like, this is kind of weird because it sounds awfully a lot like the other one, where she got, a Mustang, guns, like exactly what she would want. And here we have somebody, an ex-member who is now giving her, who's now dead and giving her much of the same thing.
And they had just gone through a divorce.
Right. So, yeah, I don't know.
So Terri contacted Alice, Don, and their mutual friend Ben Johnson, who was also a follower, and told them she was just worried about Glenn. So they went to Glenn's cabin, where they found him lying on his back on his bed with a foamy substance oozing from his mouth. An open can of Coors was on his nightstand, along with 2 pills that were confirmed to be Librium and Valium, and his cause of death was ruled as a drug overdose. Glenn's family was immediately suspicious of Terri's actions, which, yeah, I would be too. Glenn's mother recounted how Terri was crying and talking at Glenn's funeral, but was frequently looking at her to see if she was getting a reaction. So like she was like, ooh, ooh, but making sure that his family was like seeing her sob. And the whole thing just felt theatrical. The final account of the estate also took Glenn's family by surprise. They weren't aware of Glenn's note, and in the divorce proceedings only 2 weeks before, the judge had awarded Glenn all proceeds that came from the jewelry business he ran, which was worth about $85,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $500,000. That's about $692,000 in 2024. And then on top of this, only 5 months after Glenn's death, Terri went on to marry a man named Ben Johnson. Following Glenn's untimely death, multiple members of conscious development questioned their faith in Terri, and people immediately grew suspicious or fearful, or both. This got even worse when Terri and Sandra introduced the idea of bloodletting in order to cleanse members of the group who Terri said were, quote, poisoned. Terri would later claim that she never approved of bloodletting, despite Sandra doing so anyway, but this claim has been refuted by nearly everyone who was a part of the group at the time. What a weird, archaic form of healing, bloodletting. I mean, we knew that didn't do anything. Well, some of it does something, but we know that wasn't like a practical healing practice for a very long time.
Yeah, I'm like, is this for healing or just,
some like
an occult
weird
ritual type thing, that Sandra came across or something?
That's a good point too. During the same year, Sandra Cleaver claimed that her daughter Susan had been entirely taken over by evil forces. If you remember, Sandra was the one who was like, she needs pills, she wasn't going to take her to the doctor, etc. This is that family again. But Sandra kept her faith in Terri and gave her even more jewelry, which she believed would keep her safe. And according to Terri, the higher a gem's value, the stronger its protection. Yeah, of course. So Sandra gave her some of her most expensive and exotic pieces in her entire collection. Sandra's devotion to Terri only increased year after year, and by August of 1978, Sandra penned a will leaving everything she owned to Terri. This included her jewels, valuable artwork, her house, and even her inheritance of $20,000 a year, which is around $150,000 today.
So serious money.
Huge cash. Only 4 days after penning this new will, 13-year-old Susan would also dedicate her $125,000 trust fund to the bank account of conscious development, which, if we remember, is really just Terri's personal bank account.
I wonder if they knew that.
Yeah, good point.
Did they know that it was going to Terri's personal account?
Yeah, maybe not. Probably not.
Probably not, yeah. God, that is so shady.
So dirty. That $125,000 would be $869,000 today. So from one family alone, Terri was willed over $1 million. Well, just one family.
In today's money.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
There were claims that Susan wasn't aware of the will that left everything to Terri. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And apparently there were 2 separate wills under Susan's name, so it gets even weirder. The first one left behind a series of sentimental items like a rock collection to her school, her basketball to her father, and her art portfolio to her mother. That seems more like what a child would leave behind, But the second will seemed professionally drafted, not in Susan's own words, and it gave Terri free will to use Susan's material holdings however she saw fit. Since Susan was only 13 years old, in the state of Texas, minors could not write their own will, and this would explain why the professionally written will was written and granted without her knowledge. There is a theory that many people mistook Susan for much older than she seemed due to her 5'10" height, But that seemed like a pretty flimsy theory in the whole thing, especially for a legally binding document that would, afford her over $800,000 and basically ruin her life, right? Doesn't make sense. Terri, of course, would later claim she had no knowledge of the second will that gave her all this financial power. Oh, what? To me? No way. But it was notarized by her follower, Alice Hoffman, who was also witnessed by 2 other conscious development members.
Of course, they notarized this themselves.
I know. And so it's like Terri absolutely knew. This is ridiculous. On top of all this, Susan actively despised the conscious development group and found their musings and meditations extremely off-putting and bizarre. This fanatical devotion to the teachings from her mother also made it increasingly difficult for Susan to make friends at school, and having friends over at her house always ended in Susan having to justify her mother's odd behavior. God, so the whole thing sounds like a nightmare. So when Susan turned 14, she was legally able to choose which parent she wanted to live with. According to Susan's classmates, she said she wanted nothing more than to live with her father, Chuck. They got along really well, and Susan looked up to him as a perfect role model. But doesn't end well. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Terri's manipulation tactics had wormed their way into her mother Sandra's personality, and over the next year it would manifest in a way so disturbing and unforeseen that it's typically the first thing mentioned when Terri Hoffman is brought up. Knowing that Susan would most likely choose her father, Chuck, over her, Sandra attempted to connect on a personal level with her daughter for the first time in her life. She had a heart-to-heart with Susan following her 14th birthday, and during their conversation, Sandra allegedly remembered that she was molested by Chuck as a young girl. Which, what?
Whoa.
Supposedly, this was one of the reasons she struggled with Chuck's visitations. There was never any evidence or allegations that this same abuse happened to Susan. But this revelation confused and upset Chuck. But at the same time, he was torn because he could see that his daughter and ex-wife were finally reconnecting in some way. Sandra then invited Susan to join her and Lynn Fairchild, her fiancé, on a pre-wedding vacation to Hawaii in February 1979. Being a young, impressionable 14-year-old who finally had a mother in her life, Susan was pretty hyped about this. I mean, who doesn't want to go to Hawaii, right?
Right.
So on the 29th of that month, Sandra, Susan, and Lynn went to a small lagoon in Hawaii that Sandra had gone to before. Lynn took a nap while the mother and daughter took a blue inflatable raft out onto the water. This particular lagoon was relatively quiet, calm, and just out of the way enough so no one but a local would really know about it. Beneath the water in the deeper area hid a coral reef that was razor sharp. And at some point, their raft supposedly flipped over and they were flung into the water. Susan, who is widely known as a very strong swimmer, shouted for help, and Sandra was sucked under the water. When she reemerged, her daughter was nowhere to be seen. Lynn overheard the commotion from the shore and contacted the emergency services, and Sandra was eventually rescued by the fire department, yet Susan's body would be recovered from the same reef, lifeless. Which, this is all very sketchy. And just tragic.
Yeah.
Chuck, who was in the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, was on his way to Hawaii when he got news of Sandra being in the hospital and his daughter, quote-unquote, being missing. Susan Cleaver was later declared dead when they found her body. Sandra was in the hospital and Terri was already on her way. Chuck then received a phone call on his home phone while he was on the plane, and one of Terri's followers had a message for him. It was Susan's will. When he visited her in the hospital, Sandra was in complete shock, crying and thanking him for coming to see her. But as Terri entered the room, the tears immediately dried up and a subdued demeanor came over her. Sandra soon mentioned that their daughter would be happier in heaven. It's just very eerie, man.
Yeah. And we do know, that she was threatening her daughter's life.
Yeah.
Which right before they
And here she goes saying that thing, the same statement again, happier in heaven. So it's like, what actually happened out there on that raft? 2 months after losing her daughter, Sandra took out a $300,000 life insurance policy, which is equivalent to over $2 million in today's money. The beneficiary was none other than Terri herself. And in June of that year, Sandra helped incorporate conscious development and made Terri the sole member of its board of directors, which could it be any more obvious?
Yeah, it's
My
like
God.
No balance of power.
Yeah. Terri then divorced Ben Johnson and married Richard Donald Hoffman, who went by Don. This was also her follower. So not only is she's having inappropriate relationships with people in this group, this religious group.
Yeah. And this was one of the guys who discovered her ex-husband's dead body.
Right.
Because that was Alice who
this is all
got
getting
the phone
so
call.
Weird.
Yeah.
So weird. On June 12th of 1981, Sandra wrote a new will that also included her mentioning a friend named Wheezy Watson being the executor, another member of the conscious development group. Strangely, she would then send a copy of his will to her brother, Croom Beatty IV. Croom didn't get along with Sandra, and he found the entire will completely odd and theatrical. It had meticulous notes of his phone conversations with her and mentioned specific dates and names that had no bearing on the estate. And the whole thing insisted that Sandra was the one who wrote it. The letter ended by saying that she was taking a trip to Colorado Springs to look at some land that Terri and Don had recently purchased, I believe, for a retreat center or something. And Weesey was going along with her. Croom saw the writing on the wall and allegedly told his wife, quote, "She won't be around long, and he would soon be proven right," which is like, what do you know? So this is just a wild fucking group here.
Yeah.
Like,
and very, like, it gets, not literally incestuous, but you can see Terry's pulling all these strings and like marrying her followers, like not only her own followers, but her followers' ex-husbands who she probably manipulated into divorcing in the first place because of her whole soulmates thing. So yeah, a lot of woven threads.
Yeah, definitely the puppet master here for sure.
So on September 9th, 2 months after rewriting her will and creating a fully functioning business for Terry's cult, Sandra and Wheezy spent the night at Terry's sister's place in Colorado Springs. Around noon the next day, a paramedic at the Air Force Academy spotted the Mercury Lynx they had been driving at the base. It was at the bottom of a 450-foot cliff off of Gold Camp Road. Both women had been thrown from the vehicle and died on impact. There were no skid marks, no animal carcasses, or anything indicating a crash. It appeared that Sandra had intentionally driven the car over the cliff's edge. A very intense legal battle for Sandra's wealthy estate followed. Croom suspected what was going on and took Terri to court. Good. But, of course, Terri would not be going down without a fight, as we know there's a ton of money to be gained in this. During the court proceedings, Terri would make an absolute fool of herself on the courtroom floor. She would admit to influencing witnesses, using tranquilizers, and admitting that the insurance policy from Sandra went directly to her personal bank account.
You'd think that'd be enough for criminal charges.
Right? And it's like, this is wild. We have a motive here. When questioned, she claimed she couldn't remember most of her teachings in conscious development and didn't know what the 4 liberations were, despite having written them herself. She's just
God.
A local psychotherapist and hypnotherapist named Mary Ellen Grundman was brought in. According to Mary, Terri could have easily hypnotized and manipulated Sandra into reacting a certain way under specific circumstances or stimuli. Now, we should take into account here, this is a time when hypnotherapy was kind of blowing up, and we didn't really, this concept of hypnosis was kind of, maybe, I think it was just another term for what we call like programming now or brainwashing. Yeah. But they're trying to propose that through this weird meditation and this cult, they were hypnotized. So take it as like a form of programming, I guess. But as the court battle continued, Terri became less certain that she was going to win against Croom. She ended up agreeing to give him $50,000 immediately, with another $62,000 to be paid on Halloween. And in addition, Sandra's house would not be Terry's, but instead sold, and 40% to be given to Croom, and the remainder to Terri and Don. All of Sandra's remaining estate would be divided equally between them. So, wow. I mean, this goes to show that even if you kind of will things to one person, you can take people to court over it and say, like, this is just there's something fishy going on here, and the court can decide to divide things up.
Yeah, and maybe she was worried that if he wins this, that others might come for the other wills
Snowball,
that she benefited from, you know? Like, so she was willing to kind of settle with him to keep that from happening, perhaps. But
yeah, it's kind of a loss for Terri.
Yeah, exactly. She's like, I'll take the L here, but I'm not losing the rest of my wealth here. Sandra, Susan, Glenn, and Weesey had all become program victims of Terri's, but there were many more to come. Another follower named Robin Otstott became the replacement to Sandra Cleaver for Terri. She was rabidly devoted and obsessive towards Terri and her teachings. Robin had been involved prior to Sandra's death, working as a correspondence writer for Terri's teachings, as well as testifying during the trial over Sandra's estate. Robin was also one of the 40 chosen teachers who would frequently battle against the Black Lords on a weekly basis. The thought of their existence terrified Robin, but she took comfort in Terri's confidence and teachings. Terri had constructed a wonderfully elaborate lie that kept Robin on pins and needles day after day. There you go, another cult leader tactic there, right? Terri was no stranger to matchmaking. She frequently put couples together and then drove them apart. Ah, man, truly a master manipulator. My God.
It's scary.
She soon convinced 41-year-old Robin that she was in a close and intimate relationship. Get this. This is pretty fucking nuts. A supernatural CIA agent by the name of George G, baby. Like, what? Where'd she pull this out of?
Oh,
supernatural CIA agent.
What does that even mean? That doesn't even make any sense. Also, man,
the CIA's in the astral realm? That's scary. I
mean,
maybe shit. What do we know?
The thing is like, this is also just a prime example of how programmed Robin is, right? Like, if she is convincing her that there is some supernatural CIA agent that is her soulmate in basically a different dimension, yeah, like Robin is in way, way too deep.
Yeah, totally. I mean, she's battling the Black Lords on a weekly basis, so I would say it's pretty deep in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, she's convinced of this metaphysical CIA agent, a true patriot, and manifestation. But this wasn't really news to her followers because Terri had apparently talked about training quote-unquote dematerialized CIA agents for quite some time. So now she's working for the government. She's got a government contract. She's got a bunch of dematerialized CIA agents. Which, if you're brainwashed by her, that's got to be terrifying to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, I kind of want to be a dematerialized CIA agent. That sounds fun.
I wonder if there's any unclassified files on this dematerialized. Which, again, I think it's like she knew enough because there's definitely unsealed documents of the CIA doing experiments with like remote viewing and astral projection and stuff.
True.
So kind of like researching this whole idea of astral realms and things like that. So,
and knowing Terri, she has pulled everything else from something
everywhere
else. So yeah, you're probably right.
She hit the CIA.gov website and started searching. She's like, what scary shit can I find on here to use against them?
No, Josh. She accessed the records, man.
That's right. She didn't go to the CIA.gov. She went straight to the Akashic Records, to the U.S. government section. Found out. Could you tell us who killed JFK?
It was the red, white, and blue crystal that she went to. She got all the USA government information.
Of course. Should have known better. Unfortunately for Robin, though, Terri told her there was no chance of her ever marrying her soulmate George because it would endanger national security. Allegedly, this would lead to Robin's spiral into depression, which is just sad, right?
Yeah, it is.
Which in turn caused her to lash out at her friends within conscious development who started distancing themselves from her. So it's like, what happened to this whole idea of like acceptance and love? That seems to be going out.
Yeah.
Long gone.
That was the motto at first, but we've moved way past that.
And over the next few weeks, Robin's mental state would only continue to deteriorate despite counseling from Terri, which I'm sure did not help whatsoever.
No.
The writings in her journals would leave behind a distressing roadmap to Robin's isolation and suicidal ideation. She then began to neglect her teenage son, who before meeting Terri was everything to her. She began losing friends at work, and then in a bizarre cry for help, she called her ex-husband and told him she had contracted viral hepatitis. Her ex-husband set up a doctor's appointment for her, and since he was seriously confused by what she claimed, he eagerly waited for the results.
Good for him.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a nice thing to do. On April 21st, 1987, Robin Otstott would go to her scheduled appointment and have her blood drawn. This work would confirm that she did not have hepatitis. Immediately following this discovery, she went to Terri with the news, and she wrote an entry into her journal that reads as follows. I am apologizing to Terri 3,000 times a week on all levels of my being for the highly offensive, rude, and vulgar comments made to her last week. I love her dearly and beg her forgiveness someday.
Man.
I mean, that just says so much about the Terri effect on her.
Yeah.
And this is absolutely terrible. But Robin then allegedly took a .38 revolver, placed the barrel in her mouth, and took her own life. She left no note to her son and left all of her jewelry, clothes, personal files, her Colorado land purchases, bedroom furniture, and figurines to Terri. Anything else went to her son, and if he didn't want it, it would then go to Terri. Just like you see a pattern happening here.
Yeah.
That really is hard to ignore.
Yes.
During the investigation of her home, a single note on the bathroom mirror scribbled out a series of affirmations right above a trash bin filled with syringes and prescription drugs. And the scribbles read, draw in light, my light, sheer will, deny yourself, quiet depression, go forward even if I'm behind now, get out of bed, learn whole new way of being, push through the pain. I didn't do it, parts of me did. Go forward for Terri, for the masters. I still want to work with the masters. Don't let those assholes get me down.
Wow.
So just a wild affirmation.
Yeah.
The year of 1987 would see the death of one more religious member and one unsolved disappearance of another. On November 30th of that year, another follower, Mary Alice Levinson, passed away from a drug overdose in a hotel room in Chicago. The autopsy discovered a needle puncture mark on her left wrist, and it was concluded that she had overdosed on 2 types of prescription sleeping pills. Apparently, the toxicology report also noted trace elements of an unknown medication, which was the same as was found with Glenn Cooley years prior. Like, that is so sketchy and weird, right? Like, what is this medication? While alive, Mary had also discovered her soulmate boyfriend through Terri, and she had replaced her siblings as a sole beneficiary of her life insurance policy with a new boyfriend in conscious development. Who do you think orchestrated that?
Right.
Whose name has mysteriously not been mentioned in any reports. In a tape-recorded message from Mary, she would mention that she had used her divorce settlement money to pay off a series of small debts and donations to charities. It's interesting that the debts and charities are unnamed. And if they actually exist, they were never revealed.
Yeah, I don't
I wonder if there's like validity to that, or if there's something sketchy going on with that. I don't know. Maybe they just didn't want to be released for some reason.
Right.
It's kind of weird. Considering she also made several purchases of fine jewelry with her mother's charge card, it might be obvious what these charities and debts were. In the messages, she also said, I want you to understand that I am fully rational and I've come to this decision after a long time of thinking. I am actually looking forward to it. Obviously, with my past work with animals, I believe in euthanasia for those who are suffering horribly.
Ugh.
Sadly, Mary had been described by a doctor as nearly, quote, immobilized by anxiety and tension. She had attempted suicide several times before, but she had made positive progress after discovering Terri's teachings. She had found the strength to try again. Which is I don't know. Like, all the mental health issues with all of these members is just...
It's not a coincidence.
No,
right?
no.
She's probably preying on these people actively. So another similar breaking point for another member of conscious development happened the month after Mary passed, and in December of 1987, well-known local English professor Charles Sothern Jr. was found wandering the streets of Chicago, speaking incoherently in an unknown language. He was recovered by members of his family who immediately checked him into the Michael Reese Hospital to get him examined. Terri was one of Charles' newest fascinations, and he was quickly rising through the ranks of conscious development as she programmed him. He was one of the 40 teachers who led meditations, which, as we know, those were like the super close members. He spoke to new members about joining and fought the Black Lords during their spiritual warfare. Despite how heavily he leaned into this new religious movement, it would seem that he knew something was off. After he was released from the hospital, he began distancing himself from the group right away. Being well-traveled, Charles planned on returning to India, supposedly in an attempt to remove himself from Terri's grasp. It's not a bad idea, just move to the other side of the world. But after not speaking to his parents for a concerning amount of time, they broke into his home to search for him. Among the few things left was a vial with something mysterious inside. A toxicology report would show that it was something similar to a poison from plant extracts. This was like something you would put on the tip of a poison arrow.
Yeah, that's
very odd, right?
I wonder who would be looking into that.
Other things found were his outerwear left on a stool in the traditional Nigerian sign of death, and 2 notes that were barely legible. These notes named Terri twice, while also mentioning that he had come, quote, under a bad influence and was trying to fight it myself, end quote. In these same notes, he named Terri the executor of his estate, and just like the others, willed his possessions to her. Charles Sothern Jr. was never seen again.
But let's talk about Charles Sothern Jr. for a sec. Like, how did he just like disappear? And this looks to me like possibly a staged scene here. I mean, it just lines up too perfectly with everything else. The fact that he mentions Terri twice in the note and then also leaves all of his estate to her.
Right.
And then just disappears. And then this like poison's there. I don't know. It's just so weird.
It doesn't make any sense, really. I mean,
maybe he did just leave, and
there's always that chance that
it's possible.
He did just pack up and leave all.
Or he staged his own disappearance.
Yeah, totally possible. But I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it definitely raises some questions.
But why would he leave everything to Terri? Why not like take that with you?
Yeah, or leave it to a family or something. I don't know.
Super strange. But one of the ugliest fallouts from the conscious development was just around the corner. Jill Bounds, a psychologist who had joined the religious group back in 1979. Around the time when a lot of Terri's victims began to disappear, Jill took notice, and she left the group in December of 1982. Shortly afterwards, she told anyone who would listen that Terri was a danger. She even referred to Terri as the witch, and wasn't concerned about telling people that she was genuinely afraid of what Terri was capable of doing. So now you kind of have like a whistleblower in the group here. Jill could identify Terri's manipulation because Jill had developed her own expertise in manipulation as well. Following her divorce and her move to Dallas, she went through a series of affairs and brief hookups. She then used her knowledge of psychology to manipulate these men into giving her all sorts of gifts and attention. Friends and family said that Jill lived 2 separate lives. One of her ex-lovers, an attorney named Jim Truitt, said that one side of Jill was charming, outgoing, and loving. She would do anything for a friend. But then the other side of her was dark, angry, and manipulative. She would get so angry that if he was ever late, even for a minor thing, it would send Jill into a rage. So much so that she would even throw punches and scream. For a while, she knew how to fool just about anyone. When she eventually met Terri, her world of metaphysics and New Age religion brought some amount of balance to her life and personality for a while. But this balance would all come to an end in 1988 after she turned on Terri and began calling her the witch. On the night of September 21st of that year, a stranger broke into Jill's home through a window in her townhouse and smashed her head in with a blunt object, possibly a tire iron, killing her. A client discovered her body the next day, and outside of her townhouse, her mother later found what she called a bizarre occult drawing and a toy robot with its head smashed in and its legs ripped off. Jill's case had several suspects. Investigators noticed her gun was missing, and her connection to Terri obviously brought up some questions. By Jill's own admission, Terri was capable of things many didn't suspect. And given her influence over the Dallas metaphysical communities, it's possible Terri could have orchestrated the murder. But ultimately, no one was charged, and her case remains unsolved to this day. Wow. I mean, if you think this is orchestrated by Terri, I mean, that just like sends chills down my spine, because it's like, this is a truly dangerous person.
Yeah, this would be just a straight up hitman case.
Yeah.
Breaking into her home and murdering her.
Her influence is out of control.
And the fact that, her case remained unsolved, they couldn't find a motive for the killer. It's like, well, who does have a motive?
Yeah, why isn't no one's connecting the dots here? No one's like, maybe we should look into this Terri Hoffman character.
Yeah, I think ultimately Terri knew just how to cover her tracks, right? Terri's last suspected victims were David and Glenda Goodman, and this story is wild. David was a troubled but extremely intelligent man who had a teaching PhD at Southern Methodist University. He was known for never being able to settle down, and despite his fierce intelligence, he didn't want to spend his life sitting behind a desk, grading papers, or giving lectures. After his wife left him and took their sons with her, he fell into a deep depression. Despite spending hundreds of dollars on counseling sessions, he just couldn't pull himself out of the hole that he was in. At one point, he attended one of Terri's lectures, and he didn't find it all that interesting, but he wanted to learn more about Terri's life mantras. Terri welcomed David with open arms and found the free-spirited and non-judgmental home he had longed for. Meanwhile, he quickly remarried, and then he quickly got divorced again, and then Terri used her matchmaking to set him back up, and he remarried again, but then divorced again after 3 years. And despite all these failing relationships, David had a very successful career, and in 1985 and 1986, he co-authored a research book on investment strategies, and the success in sales quickly garnered hundreds of eager investors who wanted to know more about the software that David and his co-workers talked about in the book. But during the height of his success, David suddenly penned a letter of resignation and vanished. He never said goodbye, never cleaned out his desk, or gathered his belongings, and the reality was that David had leveraged his knowledge about the market and software to land high-paying clients who wanted his recommendations for stocks. And also at this time, he had found his soulmate, Glenda Warheide, and he just seemed to be on the path to success, freedom, and happiness he so desperately wanted to have after he was in that deep depression. They married in 1983, and who officiated the ceremony? Terri Hoffman. Glenda had 3 children from a former marriage. She had once been an outspoken and happy single mother who loved having her children around, but after meeting David, something changed. Her oldest son lived with his bio father, but her 2 daughters lived with her, and then out of nowhere, she sent them to also live with their father in Houston, only for them to be transferred to Singapore. To make it even more strange, David and Glenda imposed a strict visitation rule that her children would only be able to visit for 2 weeks max during the summer. It's unclear why their living situations had so drastically changed, but many suspect that Terri had something to do with it behind the scenes. It was obvious Terri had a strong influence on their lives because between the years of 1987 and 1988, the Goodmans had given more than $110,000 to Terri's conscious development. This is not limited to cash payouts or jewelry like the others. They also gifted Terri a brand new 1988 Lincoln Continental, along with several perfumes and assorted gifts that ran into the tens of thousands in cost. They said the money and gifts were to, quote, speed up infinitely the process of reaching and awakening souls. And I mean, we've seen that. Remember, that was kind of quoted in people's divorces where it's like, oh, you're hindering my spiritual awakening. And then it's like, the more we give to Terri, we're speeding up that process, right?
Convenient for Terri.
Yeah, very convenient.
She seems to be the only one benefiting from all this.
Yep.
How is the group benefiting from these gifts?
They're not. The Goodmans then suddenly ceased all communications with their family members, citing that they were impeding their spiritual growth and they needed to dispel the negative energies around them. This is, we've seen this, like I said, time and again with some of the other members. In a series of journals, they both detailed the effect that Terri had on them. They claimed they had discovered they had lived 800,000 lives before their current one, that they were not of this earth, the dangers of the Black Lords, the importance of giving Terri half of their earthly possessions, and the dangers of negative karma. So they are just fully into Terri's teachings. And that is a common part of cults, as we know, disconnecting from your close family members. That's a surefire sign that you're in a cult. In 1989, David and Glenda locked themselves in their garage, which they had converted into a den in Lake Highlands. 5 weeks had passed before neighbors noticed a rotting smell seeping from the Goodman's garage just after Thanksgiving. The fire department was soon contacted and they kicked down the Goodman's front door. The stench was nearly unbearable. 2 of the firefighters went outside and vomited on the front lawn. It was so bad. So they went back, they grabbed gas masks from their truck before heading back in, and they just noticed the house was filled with thousands and thousands of flies. Just big black clouds swarming through the house. The firefighters stepped through the insect carcasses that they had all died on the floor as well, and they made their way into the garage that had been converted into a den. In other circumstances, the room would be, it looked like a nice cozy place to spend a nice weekend afternoon, but firefighters walked into a horrific scene. On the coffee table sat a Ruger Mark II semi-automatic pistol, a box of high-velocity shells, and a gun manual. Nearby, the bodies of the couple rested on the plush sky blue carpeting. Each had a single gunshot wound to the head. Their bodies were deep in the process of decomposition, and they had been dead for more than 1 month. Their deaths were ultimately ruled a double suicide. On hearing the news, Terri didn't show any signs of concern. The deaths of her followers had just become a feature of her cult at this point. Oh, man.
Yeah, and again, the scene is taken for what it is. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem like investigators ever really thought to look into it a little bit further and be like, is there a reason for them doing this? There's a manual next to the gun. It looks suggesting
did they just buy this for this?
Yeah. Right. So kind of mysterious.
And they're not wrong. It was if it's ruled a double suicide, it can for sure just be a double suicide.
Right. But End of investigation.
Yeah. But we know, as you look at these back to back to back, it just raises more suspicion on Terri, right?
Right. Why not look into their lives a little bit deeper and see who they were affiliated with?
Exactly.
Kind of follow the trail. And it just seems like that never happens.
Yep. Because, there is one common denominator between all these deaths and disappearances. It's Terri.
Hoffman. Yeah.
So one of the strangest deaths surrounding conscious development happened about 1 year before the death of the Goodmans, but this death really started the whole snowball decline of Terri Hoffman. So Terri's husband, Donald, had been complaining about a series of illnesses he'd been experiencing over the last few months. He grew more paranoid about his health after being frequently out of breath when hiking and often fatigued by simple tasks around the home. Granted, Don was just getting a little bit older, but for some reason he was convinced his health concerns indicated a much bigger problem than just simple aging. In September 1988, Don checked into the Marriott Hotel in Las Colinas, Texas. Room service knocked on his door on September 16th, and there was no answer. So room service then entered his hotel room where they saw him in bed, so they apologized and left. When they returned, though, later that day, they found him in bed again, but they noticed he hadn't moved from the first time they had seen him. Emergency services were notified and Don was pronounced dead at the scene. A case of open Benadryl rested on the nightstand alongside a note pointing out which car in the lot was his, as well as a 3-page suicide note. 3 videos of Don were also later discovered by his family. They were separately addressed to his children and siblings, and in the videos he reaffirmed his belief in Terri's teachings, as well as encouraged them not to be too harsh with her. He claimed she had a weak heart and would already be struggling with the choice that he had made. He also revealed that he had terminal cancer that was inoperable, and he claimed this was identified by 3 different medical professionals, and he was afraid of going through treatment on top of the debilitating effects he was already feeling on his body. So Don Hoffman's official cause of death was eerily similar to Terri's other ex-husband, Glenn Cooley, and Mary Levinson, which they both died from a drug overdose. A toxicology report showed an abnormally high amount of MDMA, and Don apparently claimed this had been prescribed to him by a doctor.
Which, how would that even be true? What doctor is prescribing an abnormally high amount of MDMA?
Right.
That seems like bogus to me.
Mm-hmm. So the medical examiner also noticed that his body didn't show any signs that he had cancer at any point. But in the time before Don's death, he was 100% certain that he did have cancer. He even claimed that 3 different medical professionals confirmed this, but no trace. Don's son Rick decided to call Terri and question her about Don's diagnosis, and he secretly recorded the whole thing. And during this conversation, Terri wept, she prophesied, and she rambled her way through the entire conversation. And when questioned about Don's diagnosis and the lack of cancer in the autopsy, she said that his medical records and prescriptions were destroyed by the doctors who had made the discovery, which that doesn't make any sense.
No.
Why would, and I'm sure that's highly illegal.
Absolutely. And why would they have done that? Why would all 3 destroy any evidence of this?
She's clearly caught in a lie, and she doesn't know what to do here. So when Rick pressed her, Terri claimed that this was obviously the work of the Black Lords.
Haven't they been at war with these guys? Haven't they gotten rid of them at this point?
Nope. The war is always ongoing, Josh. Apparently, the Black Lords had tricked the doctors into not even seeing the cancer. So she's going, no, they destroyed the records, and now she's going, the Black Lords tricked the doctors into not even seeing the cancer in the first place. Rick kind of called her out, and he asked her to psychically check the Akashic records, because he's like, hey, if you can do this, go and check this out.
Yeah, get the real tea here. What's the real facts?
If it was truly a multiversal record of everything, like Terri had claimed, the answer would surely be in there, right? Maybe it's not as simple as that, but I mean, I like that he's calling her out on this. Terri told him she had tried, but failed to access.
Oh, her access is revoked conveniently when you're caught in your lie.
Yep. Her little library card no longer
even
works.
The Akashic records is like, we need to keep this bitch out. Like, she's done. There's got to be like a term of conditions to have access to this. Like, when you start using it for evil, they're like, whoever runs it's like, no, access revoked.
It's like an evidence room in a police station. You have to like check in, check out. Like, you kind of observe their surveillance inside.
They just have like a fucking, board at the entrance that has Terri's face on it. Like, if
it's not allowed,
call the authorities immediately.
It's like at a bar when people are just too belligerent every time they come in, so they get permanently shut out. Yeah. You just have your picture put up on the board where it's like, do not allow inside. That's Terri.
Around the same time, on April 19th, 1989, the Dallas County coroner filed Don's will. He had unsurprisingly left all of his property, money, and possessions to Terri. Don's suspicious death, the fake cancer, and the will that left Terri with everything had a devastating effect on Don's children, as you can imagine.
Oh, yeah.
In response, Rick Hoffman and his sister Janet filed a lawsuit against Terri, which fucking finally.
Yep.
They claim that their father's death was a result of Terri using, quote, hypnosis, behavior modification, mind control, and emotional manipulation. They claimed his death was wrongful, and they contested the final will. They became some of the few who dared to go against Terri. While they were tied up in pretrial hearings, their lawyer, James Barklow, decided to take matters into his own hands. He actually went to Terri's house and searched through her garbage, and what he found was swaths of syringes, emptied pill bottles, and cotton swabs. So what the hell's up with that? That's very weird. He also found a letter from someone named Peter in San Diego. Apparently, he had sent Terri crates of amphetamines along with some mystery drug that counteracts the effects of these amphetamines.
Which, I don't know, I'm ignorant to...
Is it stuff she's taking? Or is it something that she's using on other people? Is this like tranquilizer type stuff?
I think there's a little more evidence where like people it'll come up where it's like, oh, she was giving me vitamin shots and no one knows what was in there. But I'm completely ignorant to this if someone can fill me in. Are there drugs that counteract amphetamines? Is that a real thing?
I would assume so, right?
Or it's like whoever is sending her the shipment is claiming that he's also adding like, oh, here's some drugs that'll negate the effects.
I'm assuming it's probably just going to be lawyer talk because all I'm seeing is that there's antidotes, there's like agents to counteract amphetamine toxicity, but I'm assuming it's just like drug dealer talk, like saying, hey, this will help you fall asleep after you take too many.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's like drinking coffee when you're too drunk or something like that. Something like that. It's not really negating the effects. It's just kind of combating certain
help you with the come down or something. Yeah. Well, Leonard Goodman, the father of David Goodman, who was the man found in the garage with a bullet in his head, also filed a lawsuit against Terri. He claimed Terri, quote, not only influenced, but had almost total control over her son and daughter-in-law. As the pattern of deaths followed Terri, finally, a criminal investigation was launched by the Dallas District Attorney's Office in January 1990.
1990?
Yeah. After like over a decade, if not more. But the accusations of Terri using hypnosis was weak. Assistant DA Cecil Emerson also said that it would be difficult to determine if mind control could legally be a contributing factor in a death. Which I guess I get that, but...
Yeah.
Terri and her religious movement, Conscious Development, denied any wrongdoing during the investigation, because of course they did. But several witnesses reported that Terri had subjected them to syringe shots that she called vitamin shots.
Okay, what?
So she's injecting them now.
With some
type of concoction, yeah. Some received the shots several times from Terri, and it's unclear what was actually in these shots. Was she like coming up with some like true serum type shit? Or you know what I mean? Like what? Some MDMA like microdosing shit? Like what is she doing?
She's like, we're going to go to the Akashic Records.
Whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Good God, dude.
This is terrifying too, because like, man, we talk about this where it's like we want to be able to view ourselves outside of this. Like, oh, we would never, ever do something like this. But man, imagine being so locked into this cult that you're willing to take some mystery drug in a syringe from somebody because you just fully believe in your heart that this person has good intentions.
Yeah. Yeah. In this case, I see how this happened and why it happened. But yeah, it's hard to fathom. On top of this, at both Glenn and Don's crime scenes, there was some undetermined white pill whose contents were still under investigation. And it might have been a homemade drug that investigators had yet to have come across, which I could totally see Terri like just some doing
weird connections.
On the Akashic Record drug section, there's some drugs that have never been known to man yet. I started making them in my house. It was also discovered that David Goodman had a son who had a close connection with Terri at one time, and he had a criminal record involving ecstasy, a pressed powder pill of MDMA, a stimulant, and psychedelic. And this was the same drug that made up the majority of Don's cause of death, and the same drug he once claimed was prescription by a doctor. Okay.
So it sounds like they had some underground drug supply.
Totally.
And I could totally see, like you were saying, like she's accessing the Akashic Records and maybe being like, here, we should take these. These are healthy for you. I also think, how we've seen Terri steal all these concepts from other people. Remember how Sandra had that contact with that guy who was delivering her like sugar pills, the placebos on the Greyhound bus.
Right.
She probably witnessed that and was like, oh, I could push drugs on people too. We see Sandra just willing to pop 20 pills who are supposedly going to make her better and maybe get her daughter to take these pills. These people they're in dire straits. They have mental health problems. So yeah, she probably was getting into the drug manufacturing business and like pushing whatever onto these people. And
it probably aided her in her manipulation as well.
Yeah.
I mean, if they're not in the right frame, a sober state of mind, that just makes them more mendable.
Yes.
Which I'm assuming is was part of her intention with all this. After 4 years at the end of all the investigations and delayed civil lawsuits, nothing would come of it, which is absolutely fucking mind-blowing. Prosecutors failed to find concrete evidence linking Hoffman to any of the deaths. All the evidence was seen as circumstantial, which I'm like, who gives a shit? People get prosecuted on circumstantial evidence all the time, and yet they didn't move forward with indicting her. Crazy.
Yeah.
But during the investigation, Terri filed for bankruptcy in 1991, despite gaining millions of dollars in cash from last wills, hundreds of thousands in payments towards conscious development, which went straight to her bank account, and an unknown amount of money in gifted personal possessions and various estates left to her. She apparently had almost nothing left, which that's mind-blowing in itself.
I mean, I do hear, the lifestyle creep and whatnot of like, you make more money, you spend way more money.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if she was just like, oh, I'm rolling in it. And she started just blowing it all.
Or she just really believed she'd keep this scheme going for ever.
True.
And would never get caught.
Yeah.
Then in May 1994, she faced 50 years in prison, but was only sentenced to 16 months for 10 counts of bankruptcy fraud. She had failed to report an agreement to pay her lawyer 15% of any book or movie deals relating to her life story, and for failing to disclose that she had a power of attorney to control her boyfriend's bank accounts. After only serving a year, she was set free. She only saw the inside of a jail cell for 12 months. After all this, absolutely insane. In 1995, she was mentioned in the Unsolved Mysteries episode of the disappearance of Charles Sothern Jr., and by then, Terri's popularity in the metaphysical modern religious movement in Texas had faded. Her last 100 followers in Dallas and Chicago from the previous year had already dissolved. Terri then went on to marry her fifth and final husband, Roger Keenley, in 2002 and changed her name to Terri Lila Keenley. But Terri then started a website bragging about her life experiences and also attempted to release a financial advice book. Because everybody wants financial advice from you.
From the person who had bankruptcy fraud. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, but by this point, nobody's buying your damn book.
Yeah, nobody cared.
Quick Google search and you find, at least some shred of truth about who you really are. And so Terri Hoffman was no longer relevant. But Terri later died in Dallas, Texas on October 31st, 2015 at the age of 77. It is kind of odd she died on Halloween. Isn't that kind of weird?
Yeah. She's going to meet her people.
Yeah. I wonder if she knew when she was going to die. Wonder if she ever went and checked to see
those records.
Checked to see when she was actually going to die.
Oh, remember she was barred. She lost her card.
She was too busy getting everybody else's info.
Yeah.
She didn't even bother looking at her own.
Yeah.
But
she didn't see the bankruptcy fraud charges.
Yeah, she didn't see that coming. She didn't see how to get around that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, God. Well, at one point, her followers had seen her as a reincarnation of a saint, a matchmaker, a guru to the world of the masters, and a protector against the forces of the Black Lords. But to many, Terri Hoffman was simply a master of manipulation, deceit, and depending on who you ask, a murderer. The trail of bodies that conscious development left behind doesn't seem to be a coincidence, if you ask me. I mean, I'm sure many of you are like, it's pretty obvious, right? Like, she had to have been involved. Or it just shows she's still responsible for their death. Maybe not directly.
Right.
But come on. All the manipulation and brainwashing.
There has to be some manslaughter charges in here somewhere. Something like that.
Because it was very clear that Terri had the most to gain from her members dying, clearly. And come on, every single one of them left all their personal possessions to her.
Doesn't make sense.
Have we ever seen that before? I mean, it's crazy. From 1979 to 1990, 10 people with ties to Terri Hoffman died, 6 by suspected suicides, including 2 of her 4 husbands and 4 others in apparent accidents. Murder charges were never brought against her for any of it.
10 people.
Yeah, that's crazy. How did nobody start digging into this? I feel like if this had happened today, this would have all been exposed.
100%.
She would have went down for murder.
Yeah.
I think she got really lucky with the time period.
Yes.
Because there's no way that people would snuff this out way, way earlier.
Yeah, and maybe there's, now there's so much more of a digital trail left behind.
Yeah, totally.
Where perhaps there were letters and notes and conversations that weren't documented. You know, it's not like we could pull her text messages or anything between these people.
So obviously, Terri leaves behind a dark legacy of deceit and all the mysterious deaths. Although she was never tried for murder, her motives for more money, power, and power tied directly to her followers' deaths. And the fact that these deaths suddenly stopped after Terri became the focus of murder and fraud investigations, which even makes this more suspicious, if you ask me. So it's like, I go back to like the very beginning. Like, what was she ever in this to help people, you think? Or was she always scheming?
I think she was always scheming.
It kind of seems that way.
I think she had it rough. You know, if you look back, her mother with the tuberculosis, her father passing, her being abandoned by her mother. You know, but that might be an explanation for what happens, not necessarily an excuse. But yeah, it seems like early on, or maybe she kind of retconned her childhood experience with the whole cloaked figures approaching her. Like, that's all just coming from her, right? So who knows?
Is that even legit in any way?
Right.
Or is that just like a creative origin story to
Right.
the lore?
Yeah.
You know?
And then I think when it started with her diet conversation and talking to the women at the country club, at first I think she was basically just testing the field.
Totally.
Like,
well, it's like, what better first victims, you know what I mean, than some wealthy women at the country club to take advantage of.
Yeah.
And it's like a light bulb went off. She's like, oh, I can manipulate people with this knowledge that I have.
And I can manipulate rich people.
Right.
So I think
wealthy, successful people even believe my bullshit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that she was maybe just, this was her personality from the get-go.
And like she was charismatic and I guess knowledgeable enough on this stuff that it was convincing to people.
Yeah.
It's interesting that like there's literally not one mention of a nice thing she did.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's not one notable story of Terri ever doing something nice for somebody.
Yeah. And I need, like, at the very beginning, you remember the love and acceptance thing?
Yeah.
So she knew how to just get them in, but then it was just basically a nightmare after that when she got them loved.
Then add the vitamin shots in and it's a game over, you know?
Man, the drugging is.
But is it like, I'm still so curious, like, did she actually murder these people?
Did she? I mean, what do you think?
I'm trying to like, some of it, don't know how. Like, it'd be some like dematerialized CIA agent level work. I mean, I'm sorry. Like, that's like literally the only thing that makes sense to me is like, how would she have physically pulled it off?
Yeah.
Or did she manipulate other people to do her bidding? That's probably more likely.
I think it was a mix of that and then the moments of suicide where I guarantee you she was behind there. Just behind the curtain, pulling strings and making their situations, especially their emotional situations, more dire. I could totally see her being behind that.
Yeah. And especially if you go back to Sandra's quote of happier in heaven.
Yeah.
And that to me makes me believe that Terri was planting information into her members, brains about like, it's better beyond this plane of existence. You know what I mean? Like,
and you've lived thousands of lives before this and you'll live thousands of more lives. So what does this moment really matter? Right.
I mean, it has to be something like that. Like, if it all went down, if these people did end up taking their own life, she definitely, but even then, I think there's a level of responsibility and liability she carries with that.
That's what I'm thinking.
If she led them down this path, then why on earth was she never held accountable to that?
That's why there has to be a charge that is somewhere in here, but she was probably smart enough to cover her tracks and erase whatever.
And like, let's be real, police are investigating cult members' deaths.
Right.
And you gotta believe there's probably some prejudice there from law enforcement side. Like, well, this is what happens if you join a cult.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, and maybe that's why they never like investigated some of those deaths more seriously.
Yeah, they're kind
Is
of
like they were
written
like,
off.
yeah, I kind of wrote them off as like, oh, they're, they joined the cult and, this is what happens. Because if you think about other cults going on at the time too, like it was kind of like cult central during those years.
Yeah.
With Jonestown and everything. So I'm sure like the public perception was pretty skewed, and people weren't actually thinking about the people that are victims of these cults, right? And actually thinking about, wow, these are just ordinary people like you and me that fell victim to this woman, this pure evil woman that's orchestrating everything.
Yeah.
Because again, I go back to like, had this happened later on or even in the early 2000s, I feel like this just would not have panned out the way that it did.
Yeah, I think our literacy of cults and the devastation that they bring is like, we are very more in tune with it nowadays than we were back then. So I don't think you get away with something quite like this, but I also think just from a law enforcement standpoint, were they really like debriefing detectives on a lot of cults? I mean, maybe if you brought in more of like the higher ranking, like FBI or something, that would be more in tune with it. But I just don't think it was maybe as common knowledge because it was so fresh. Where nowadays it's like, we all know about cults. We know the detrimental side effects of cults. We know the checklists of cults. We know the type of cults. There's just so much information on it now, which might not have been available to people back in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. What's your take on all this, Daniel?
I mean, I think she's behind all of the deaths to some degree, maybe not having a direct hand, but like Otstott was saying, kind of pulling the strings behind the scene.
I mean, she had to have been, right?
She had to have been. And, maybe she didn't drive some of those people to suicide, but she definitely, didn't help them with the breaks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They kind of maybe convinced them that might have been the best idea and that the afterlife might have been, true freedom for them, something along those lines, push them towards that. And in the other cases, I mean, if she was being gifted all this money and she went bankrupt, that money had to go somewhere. And I'm sure that, maybe like 10, 15, 20,000 of that money may have been put towards somebody to, maybe create the other incidents of these people being killed. At least
that's a good theory too.
Or even bribery money.
Yeah. Just to keep their mouths shut.
Or hush money. Yeah.
I mean, this is such an intricate web of lies and
I could see a conspiracy even play like with her other members where it's like, hey, if you go down, I go down. You might be looped into this to some degree, but we're going to make it so that if you fully believe in me, Terri Hoffman, you'll do what I say and you'll listen to me. It could be that going on because we've seen cults do that as well. What was it? The Ant Hill Gang, just like kind of turning a blind eye or even participating in some of the most horrific things. So it happens.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that perhaps she was bribing some of her closest members. Because it's interesting, there's not been, as far as I know, any like ex-member that's like done an expose on this, you know what I mean? And like revealed, oh yeah, I was paid off, $250,000. I was involved in this and that. And
it's like the potential whistleblowers died. Right?
Yeah, totally. If anybody started questioning and started, all of a sudden they're murdered, especially with Jill's death. I mean, that was like such a,
that seemed
alarming.
blatant.
Yeah. It was like clearly somebody was, likely paid to go and take her out. Like it's just crazy. Yeah. This is honestly one of the craziest cults I think we've ever covered. I mean, it's just so like psychologically, it's just a complete mind fuck. It's like, what the hell?
And then getting away with it.
Yeah. That's what's even crazier, right? She got away with it. 12 months in prison for fucking bankruptcy fraud.
Right.
But potentially she was involved in some way in the murders of up to 10 people. That's crazy on a whole other level.
Yeah. Man.
Yeah. Wow. This one was a crazy one. So we obviously got to hear your thoughts on it. I mean, how do you break this down?
I'm going to hit those Akashic records just so I can prove that
we need to go figure this out.
Yeah.
God. Yeah. Let us know your thoughts on the Akashic records.
Yeah.
If you've ever accessed them, what's the best method for doing so?
Hit me up. I would love to know. I'm like actually legitimately going to try this meditative, like trying to access whatever this is. I'm going to do some research and I'm going to try it.
I mean, there's a lot of people that claim that it's a real thing.
I'll do some research. There's got to be some Reddit threads out there.
The first Google search don't let it deter you.
True, yeah, true.
As I say, there is no scientific evidence to back this up. But yeah, let us know your thoughts on the Black Lord's cult and the Akashic Records. We, of course, want to hear it. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you hit that follow button if you're watching us over on Spotify, or subscribe button on YouTube. We really appreciate it. And we will catch you guys next time. Until then, lights out, everybody.